Good morning. I welcome everyone to the 16th meeting of the Justice Committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely as they interfere with the broadcasting system, even when switched to silent. Apologies have been received from David McCletchy, and John Lamont is attending as his substitute, and I welcome Lewis MacDonald and Nigel Dawn, both to the committee. Item 1, decision to take business in private. I would ask you to agree to take item 3 in private, which is further consideration of our draft report on our inquiry into the effectiveness of the provisions of the Title Petition Scotland Act 2003. Are you agreed? Thank you. Item 2. It's an evidence session of the Scottish Court Services proposals for a future court structure in Scotland. The committee will hear from 3 panels on these proposals today. And can I thank all who emailed me and other committee members regarding the courts. I know a lot of people got active about this, quite rightly. I welcome to meet Eric McQueen, Chief Executive, and Clive Binning, Executive Director of Field Services, Scottish Court Service. And I'll start right away with questions from members. John Finney.
Good morning, panel. It's a question for Mr McQueen. We have a range of submissions, Mr McQueen, and one of them that we have this morning is from Victim Support, who say, and I quote, "We welcome the expansion and enhancement of video and other communication technology indicated by the Scottish Court Service." Can you indicate with regard, and I'll just be very parochial, with regard to Dingwall Sheriff Court, what facilities will be there after the closure, please?
Further, I suspect we're going to be a bit parochial today. We can ask people, as well as being parochial, to look at the broader questions as well. I'm not scolding you, not scolding you, because I know other people are going to do that. Right. Mr Binning. Sorry, Mr McQueen.
Sorry. In respect of Dingwall Sheriff Court, as with other Sheriff Courts, what we are looking to do is to make sure that video link facilities are installed in each of those areas. Primarily to deal with vulnerable witnesses in terms of the existing legislation, but also looking through to the expansion that's coming forward in terms of the forthcoming legislation. We would also expect that they will be available to local authorities in terms of social work and other local authority staff that need to interact with the courts. So we want to see a wide expansion across all of those areas, and we are committed to making that investment in those areas where courts may be closing in the future.
I note you say it's more than Dingwall there. Specifically with that, then, are you going to work, or are you already engaged with local authority partners, NHS Highland, for instance, Police Scotland, about?
Yeah. I mean, we already have an extensive range of video facilities throughout Scotland, so across every court and at 20 different locations in Scotland. So we already build on quite good foundations. Our next plans now are to expand that, particularly into those areas where courts are closing, and we will be working with all local partners in that area to find the best facility and put in place the best means that we can for that area.
So is that a guarantee, Mr McQueen?
That is a guarantee, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Graham Pearson.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. My question is more in the round about the way in which decisions were taken. Can you give us some insight into how you weighed the evidence of impact on the delivery of justice at the local level, alongside economics and savings and efficiency in terms of the way the courts operated? Because you'll be aware of the huge concerns, certainly across the south of Scotland and elsewhere in Scotland, about the implications that arise from local delivery of justice.
We haven't just addressed this just purely from a cost-cutting basis. We haven't just looked at the courts that we feel we can save money on. We've tried to look at the type of court structure that we're going to need for the future. And that's going to have to be a court structure that anticipates the justice reforms that are coming forward. A court structure that allows us to invest in services and delivery in future, and also one that's affordable in the long term. So we are looking very much at a pyramid model that will see the High Court cases dealt with in a small number of specialised centres in Scotland, a 10-year plan to move towards more specialised sheriff and jury centres as some of these sheriffs are introduced, and a smaller network of courts where the basic principles are that in terms of efficiency, we shouldn't have courts that operate less than 3 days a week, apart from the very rural areas, and where we have courts that are within 20 miles of another court, where they have capacity to take that business, we should move the business. So what we're trying to design is a court service that will be able to deal with the reforms, it will still provide access to justice, and it will be affordable in the long term. And one of the key parts of that was the access to justice principles that were defined by the senior judiciary. So that has acted as a test for us. Now, we fully understand that for some individuals, that will mean travel of a slightly longer distance. We don't believe it's disproportionate to what we're trying to achieve, and we think that access to justice across Scotland will still be maintained.
How did you deliver on that belief that it wasn't disproportionate? How did you weigh that part of it up?
We looked quite hard in terms of the access levels, the number of people that were involved, the travel distances, and trying to get the right balance between that provision and trying to make sure that we get the best utilisation out of our court buildings that we have.
And did you test public opinion or look to, in any other business, would go to the customer? And in that terminology, your customers will be the witnesses and those who will attend the court.
Yeah, I mean, what we have done is done that through various representative bodies. So, I mean, this has been part of a process that has been running for over 2 years now. We started by sharing with a whole range of organisations a range of different ideas about court structure some 2 years ago. We held a series of dialogue events across Scotland involving over 300 people from those different areas to test some of the proposals, to refine some of those proposals, and indeed we did make some changes. So courts like Lanark, Tane, Selkirk were courts that we have now decided to retain. We've made changes in terms of the model for the sheriff and jury structure. We've moved to keep a single court in Angus rather than moving one of those courts to Dundee, and we've retained civil annexes in Dundee and Hamilton. We then went out to a full public consultation over the period of 3 months, and again got a range of responses and views back on that. And again, there were some changes that were made as a result of that. Part of it about the non-closure of Alloa, and part of it about moving the Peebles business to Selkirk rather than Edinburgh. So we have been listening throughout this whole period. But quite clearly, when you consult people on a range of general principles, it does come down to the individual court level. And we understand that there is a lot of emotion, there is a lot of history, there is a lot of tradition associated to the sheriff courts. And that's one of the difficulties sometimes with consultation, that we are trying to approach this on a principle basis, but quite rightly, people, their main interest in that action in terms of their individual local court.
You'll be aware that there's still, after all that consultation, a very substantial heat around this issue, and I think members of this committee have felt that heat through the various emails and contacts and so forth. One of the concerns I raised in Chamber and in the debate related to the alternatives for many witnesses who will need to use public transport to attend a court 15, 20 miles away. And we checked with the arrangements for public transport, and it's pretty meagre. So the possibilities are that witnesses for prosecution and defence could be entering on the same bus or train, and that doesn't seem to be the most encouraging way to bring people into the justice system and support us. Was that all thought through with the...
I mean, that is something we've looked quite closely, and the reality is that happens today. So there are many communities and many courts across Scotland where people will travel on the same public transport. And in some of the areas, actually, some of the changes we're bringing in might well improve that. If we take Haddington, which is the court most closest to here, at the moment, if you travel from many areas of East Lothian, you will have no choice if you go by public transport but to go on that same bus. In future, for those residents that come to Edinburgh, there will actually be a much wider range of transport through different bus services or train services, which will start to reduce that. So it is something that actually happens at the moment. And yes, there are some cases where, in some of the more remote areas, there may be some more of that. The Crown Office are very sympathetic in terms of the way they deal with witnesses and through their victim support, give advice and support to witnesses, and there are arrangements that they can put in place where they feel that there is a real risk involved to try to find alternative methods for people to transfer. Quite clearly, the Vulnerable Witnesses Bill and the extension of it will extend the classification of vulnerable witnesses, and that's why we are trying to extend out our existing range of video facilities to make that a real option for people to try to avoid some of these travel difficulties. So I think part of it is not just accepting what we deal with in the future, but actually are there technical solutions that we can try and put in place that are actually going to make a difference in the future.
I've got Roderick, you've got a supplementary.
Yes. Supplemental. In terms of your kind of survey of witnesses and the distances they had to travel, the various appendix to your report, I'm correct in thinking there was no survey of kind of witnesses attending civil proceedings and how far they were travelling?
Well, only on the same basis that they travel the same distance as other witnesses that attend the Sheriff Court.
Sorry, good.
So people come from the same population, so people will travel from the Sheriff Court district.
Are you suggesting that whether it's a criminal case or a civil case, the distances would be the same?
Yeah, I've got a point of clarification that may help, because as well as carrying out the analysis based on the residence of witnesses and the impact of travel between courts. We actually carried out the same analysis for those that are involved in child welfare hearings and family actions, and we found out that the distributions were the same.
That's as far as it went, no kind of general kind of contract or kind of DLIC cases or anything like that? Just the child welfare?
Yeah, but as I say, well, there are 2 points. First of all, the numbers of witnesses in the context of criminal proceedings, serious crime and summary crime, are far greater in numbers. And in the context of civil proceedings, the number of cases, proportion of cases that go to evidence on the merits of the case is actually very, very small as a proportion of civil cases registered.
Got the point, I think. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of Lewis MacDonald, followed by Alison McInnes, John Lamont, Sandra White and Jenny Muck. Queue places, unless you come in with a supplementary, and it must be a supplementary, not queue jumping.
Thank you very much,
Lewis.
Convener. Thank you. There's a couple of areas I'd be interested to explore. First of all, in relation to the question of costs and savings, I wonder if you're familiar with the report by Mr. Alex McLaren, which was commissioned by the East Lothian Faculty of Procurators on the costs and savings associated with closing Haddington Sheriff Court.
Yes.
You are indeed. And do you accept his finding that the additional cost to the public purse will be in the tune of £534,000?
Not at all, and I didn't think that was actually the main thrust of his report, to be quite honest. The £500,000 seems to be arrived at in terms of taking a comparison between the daily cost of running Haddington Sheriff Court and the daily cost of running Edinburgh Sheriff Court, and then simply multiplying that by the number of days. Now that's quite a false assumption to make, because quite clearly the fixed costs of Edinburgh will stay as they are, and what we will do is assume the Haddington business into Edinburgh. So therefore the cost of Edinburgh is not going to increase by any significant nature, and obviously the cost of Haddington will be taken out of the equation. So I think it's a rather strange view of trying to apply assumption in terms of how these costs transfer over, and we just don't see any underlying logic in the assumptions.
So your logic is that you can add 801 criminal cases, 1,170 civil cases with no additional cost. So your assumptions are all based on, if you like, being able to absorb in the existing infrastructure every case that comes from. And so when you get...
Just to clarify, the capacity exists within Edinburgh to take that business in without any significant issues at all. What we will be doing is moving the staff and judiciary from Haddington.
Is Edinburgh Sheriff Court not struggling to deliver on its targets already?
Not at all, no.
Let's take Aberdeen Sheriff Court then.
And can you just explain perhaps for me what you meant by fixed costs? Because you said the fixed costs will remain the same. What are the other costs?
The building costs, the staff costs, all the fixed costs associated with it will not change. Yep. So the figures that have been used is the average cost of running Edinburgh.
Staff will be required, no more payment to sheriffs, nothing.
No, but what we will do is take the staff and the sheriffs from Haddington and move them into Edinburgh. Yeah, but that's not going to change the cost base of Edinburgh as it stands.
I just wanted to.
Well, it's an interesting proposition, because the proposition is that there is nil cost to the receiving court, which I find fascinating. In relation to the targets you've set for completion of cases in our courts, how many of our city sheriff, let's take Aberdeen, Dundee, Inverness and Edinburgh as four that are receiving cases from courts that are closing. What targets do you set at the moment for the completion of trials within set timelines when you talk to your...
Our national average that we agree with the Crown is that cases should reach trial within 16 weeks. Yeah.
How many do?
And the vast majority do. Aberdeen, I think, is one which Cliff might want to pick up specifically, where we actually have plans in place to make improvement in Aberdeen.
But how many do in Aberdeen at the moment? That would be the question.
At the moment,
what percentage would reach that 16-week target?
the position is in relation to Aberdeen that the measure is the waiting period between first calling and the trial diet. Now, currently, the waiting periods at Aberdeen are beyond that, and they're in the
they're achieved within the 16
weeks
in the
region of the measure that we apply in the context of waiting periods is measured by the number of weeks between first calling and trial. We don't measure the percentage of cases that are...
Mr McQueen has said there's a target that they should reach within 16 weeks of calling. How many do?
Right.
Can you give us at least a ballpark figure? Half, a quarter, a third, two-thirds?
If you could just could I explain the performance framework that applies, because I think that may help the contextual understanding of this. There are really two important measures applied by us to test the efficacy of the system and of the operation of the court. One measure is the measure of the waiting period between first calling and trial, which, as Eric said, is set at 16 weeks, reflecting the optimal period. Now, the position in Aberdeen is that Aberdeen currently is at 23 weeks, so it is...
It's half again beyond the target, and yet the intention is to increase the caseload, and Mr McQueen says you can increase caseload at these courts with no additional cost.
Yes, for reasons that I'll explain if you
Carry
let
on,
me.
please do.
Now, the other measure which we apply as what you might call a balancing measure is the number of cases, the percentage of cases that require to be adjourned because of a lack of court time. Now, in that balancing measure, the position in Aberdeen is that the lack of time adjournment is slightly above the 5% measure at 7%. Stonehaven is at 10%. But if you let me just carry on for a second, I'll come on to the capacity issue because it is a very important one. Now, the first point is that the question of capacity does not arise in relation to what you might call court resources, because the staff and the judicial resources will follow the work, so they will transfer from Stonehaven to Aberdeen. So there is no resource cut, if you like, in relation to that redistribution of business. The other point relates to the capacity in terms of court sitting days for the receiving court to absorb the business. And for us, that is a key test of the capacity available. In that sense, we are aware that in terms of an absolute count of sitting days, it does take us close to what may be called the tolerable limits, because it actually is in the order of 90+%. That,
if I might ask, what is it at the moment at Aberdeen? If it's not, it's 97% is where you get to. Where are you at the moment?
At the moment in Aberdeen, I don't have that precisely to hand, but if you bear with me, I'll explain the overall position. The overall position has to be looked at not only account of the sitting days, but the extent to which the business from one court can be absorbed within the programme of business for the receiving court. And from that perspective, we know, having looked in detail at the timings, that in many instances the business at Stonehaven Sheriff Court is actually accommodated within 1 hour, 2 hours or less of the court sitting day. So there is a degree of capacity which will be available from that. I think the other thing that may be telling here is to look at the trends of all business, but criminal business particularly. In Aberdeen, there was a rise in serious cases which occurred in the year 11-12, and that number of solemn cases, 389, has come down to 309 in the year 12-13. So there is an easing in terms of that. In terms of summary complaints registered, Aberdeen is down from 4,500 to 3,700. So,
with respect, you can't predict future crime figures. I mean, essentially what you're saying is that Aberdeen, on its current level of demand, is woefully missing its targets. It's taking half as long again as it should to complete trials in Aberdeen. And your proposition is that you can add all the cases from Stonehaven with no cost implications and no impact on justice, either for the people in Stonehaven or for the people in Aberdeen. Is that seriously your proposition?
Yeah, what I want to do is explain the relationship between what you could call overall system performance and the performance of the courts.
Just you're having a good bite. Would you just let him finish, and then let Mr. Binning finish, and then you can come in.
In the context of overall system performance, there is much work being done to improve the system on a number of fronts. First of all, to resolve cases at the earliest opportunity, where possible at the pleading diet, by early disclosure of evidence. Similarly, at the intermediate diet, through better preparation of cases, thus to arrive at a situation where the demand for evidence-led trials is reduced. Now, that current system performance manifests itself in the performance of what is perceived to be the performance of the court. As far as the performance of the court is concerned, as I've explained, the incidence of adjournments because of pressure of court business on the day is actually around tolerable limits.
With the greatest of respect, improvements to the system you operate just now can happen regardless of whether you're closing courts or not. Really, the question is whether you are making a wise proposition, whether you, by agreeing with the government's proposition to close courts at a time when clearly a court like Aberdeen is failing completely to reach its targets. Can I put to you the words of David Hingston, a retired fiscal and lawyer in the Black Isle, who said of the closure of Dingwall that at the moment trials are typically delayed by three months in the case of Inverness Sheriff Court, and the closure of Dingwall is likely to double that. Do you accept those figures? Do you recognise those figures? Is that an accurate reflection of the position as it is, and out of your analysis of what happens next?
As far as Inverness is concerned, the waiting periods at Inverness are between 13 and 16 weeks. Now, that is around the prescribed optimal level of waiting period for the throughput of business. Now, in relation to Dingwall, Dingwall sits at 10 weeks. Now, in system terms, 10 weeks is not the optimal time lag between the first calling and the trial. And this is where it's very important to look at this in the wider perspective, because part of this is to arrive at the best balanced distribution of business across the courts. So the proposition that Inverness is labouring is actually not one that we would accept.
Please bear with me. I want to let somebody else in. There's a whole queue. You can come back in. Don't want to suppress questioning. But I've got Nigel next to you because he wants a supplementary, and I've still the whole list of people I read out before. I hope you remember where you are. Right? In the list, you do. Nigel.
I'm grateful to you, Convener. It's on precisely this point, and I'd just like to share my concerns. Can I say I may be looking at some data which Lewis doesn't have, and I'll cheerfully share it with him, but I did get the sitting times in both Aberdeen and Stonehaven, and I took a sample period from the 19th to the 22nd of March, quite frankly at random. What I found in there was, according to your own data, there were just over 18 spare hours over that 4-day period in the Sheriff Courts in Aberdeen, whereas the Stonehaven Court was only sitting for 13 hours, and this is all down to the nearest minute. So I think in there I find some evidence that you would be able to transfer and fit in the spare time that you need. I can well understand that. But then I look at the times that were taken in Stonehaven. During that period, I find 4 periods of time. I don't know how many cases there might have been, but they were periods of time that were in excess of 2 hours. Whereas if I go back and look at the spare time you've got in Aberdeen, I'm only actually finding 2 periods which have got 2 hours. Now, that suggests to me that you will need to be really very good at planning and guessing how long things are going to take. So I think I'm coming from a slightly different place from Lewis, that I will believe that at least it ought to be possible. But do you recognise there's a need to be skilled, at the very least, in planning your resources in order to make that happen?
I accept that entirely, and we do invest a considerable degree of learning, research, development and training in the context of programming the business of the courts. That is one of our core competences. I may say, though, that the examples that you provided are actually very helpful at identifying the potential inefficiencies that can accrue on a larger scale when we have a court which operates with a small level of business. The nature of court business is inherently unpredictable, and as far as we practicably can, we try to balance managing that unpredictability and at the same time deriving the benefit from a court sitting day. It's not in anybody's interest to have a court sitting for 1 hour or 2 hours out of a potential 6. So we have to find ways of drawing the right balance between the loading of court business against the level of certainty that the business will proceed on the day.
I have two specifically on those points, Convener. First of all, am I right or wrong in thinking that you might be able to add to the number of courts which can sit in Aberdeen? Can you tell me how many there are and how many there might be if push came to shove? I think I was looking at 6 sitting. Am I right in thinking that could be 7 or 8?
There is potential for extending the level of court accommodation at Aberdeen, yes.
I think it's just worth saying on there's two things that are slightly separate here. We have always had a long-term plan to expand the accommodation in Aberdeen, and we have been having discussions with the council about acquiring some of their additional space. And really it's about trying to create additional capacity for sheriff and jury business. There's no doubt about that at all. So that's something that is part of our plans. What I think is worth pointing out is that the Sheriff Principal in Grampian Highlands and Islands has been very fundamental in driving improvement across all of the north of Scotland, and particularly Aberdeen and Inverness. We have been through the plans for Aberdeen and Stonehaven in fine detail in every aspect of the court programming. And the Sheriff Principal is not only encouraging, but is very determined that this is the right answer and the right solution, and will allow Aberdeen through time to deliver a better level of performance. So this is not just officials coming through on a wishful hope that we think it's all going to be okay, but it's actually quite a detailed plan that has been signed off and agreed by the Sheriff Principal, and he is convinced of the decision.
Fine. Could I just explore the numbers? This was the last one, Convener. I have in front of me a graph, which I can cheerfully share with Lewis, which shows the total with Stonehaven and Aberdeen put together, which shows that the total number of cases is less than it has been any of the previous years, even if you move it all. I accept that. But bearing in mind the comments that Lewis MacDonald has already made, and which have been made to me by constituents as well, would you accept that there is a degree of trust required by us and our colleagues when we look at what we're being told about what's currently happening? We need a degree of trust to believe that it will be all right if you take that business to Aberdeen in a year's time. Yeah. Just in terms of capacity.
I would like to hope that the members and the MSPs here today do have trust in our professionalism and integrity. There's no way in the world that we would be bringing forward plans where we thought that the court was just going to spiral in terms of our performance. There's a very clear improvement plan in place for Aberdeen. It's agreed with the justice organisations, the sheriffs locally in Aberdeen, and it's being driven by the Sheriff Principal. As I say, we have been through the absolute detail of how that combined court programme will work, and that has the explicit agreement of the Sheriff Principal in Aberdeen.
Lord, if you'll forgive me, I know you want a supplement, but I've got a lot of people who've been waiting quite patiently, so if it's not asked, you can come in. Alison, then John Lamont, please.
Thank you. A general question before turning to the local courts in my region. You've said Aberdeen's already close to the tolerable limit, and we're then talking about adding in the Stonehaven work. What account have you taken of the civil court reforms that are coming down the line, where we're moving business, the intention is to move business down from the Court of Session into Sheriff Courts? How have you factored that into?
I mean, that's something we have taken into the planning assumptions, and we've also got to work against the backdrop that over the last 3, 4, 5 years, there has been a vast decrease in the number of cases that are coming before the courts. Both the summary criminal cases that are registered and civil business, both of those have declined by 30,000 cases. Virtually every court that we have as part of these proposals will be dealing with less business in future than they dealt with 4 or 5 years ago. So the issues of capacity don't concern us in the same way that some other people seem to be expressing them. In terms of the civil courts reform, based on the current proposals that are part of the Scottish Government's reform programme, could see something in the region of 2,700 cases coming out of the Court of Session and coming into the Sheriff Courts. There will be a national personal injury court that will be based in Edinburgh, and it will accommodate quite, I would imagine, a significant volume of that. So the proportion of cases that are coming to the Sheriff Court is quite minuscule compared to the decrease that we've seen in recent years. And the vast majority of these will be handled administratively rather than being proof hearings in the court. So we don't have any concerns at all about the intended transfer of cases from the Court of Session and the impact that it will have on the Sheriff Courts. I think it really is at the margins compared to the decrease that we've already seen in business.
And will those 2,700 cases all be equally spread across Scotland, or will there be bulges in where that work is?
I think generally speaking, is that what we do see is a proportion of cases based on where the population settlements are across Scotland which match our courts. So there will be a proportion of the cases that will be biggest that will go to Glasgow. There will be a corresponding very small number of cases that may go to Forfar in the future or wherever. So it is generally split in terms of a population split.
But I think very, very quickly, Convener, if I may, it is worth reflecting on the relationship between the number of cases that are registered and the number of cases that actually go to proof on the merits of the evidence. And again, the proportion of personal injury cases that go to evidence on the merits is small as a percentage of the overall number of cases.
Set down for proof and then discharged at the door of the court. That's another question. Because you've still allocated court time then.
Yeah. Again, the number which are set down for proof will be higher. However, I wouldn't say that it would be very substantially higher, because in personal injury cases by their nature, very often the issue that requires resolution is what is called salatium, or the amount that's actually sued for. So,
I'm just thinking of many are set down, court time set aside, the sheriff's ready or whatever is ready to hear it, and it settles on that morning because the insurance company have decided to pay up. So you have to make that distinction between, because how do you rearrange court time then?
I think we rearrange court time on the basis of the same informed estimates as we do now currently, and that is as a matter of necessity. There are more proofs set down than one for a single court proof day. It may be 2 or 3 proofs that would be set down. But in terms of the relationship between thousands of cases and cases set down for proof, the position will be the number set down again is low as a proportion of the cases registered.
Sorry, Alison, it was just to get the distinction between these.
That's helpful. Can I ask you how you respond to the view that's held quite strongly locally by professionals in the area around Stonehaven, that Stonehaven Court acts as a safety valve? Can you tell me how many solemn cases have been transferred from Aberdeen to Stonehaven recently because there's no time to progress them in Aberdeen?
Yeah, it may help if I refer back to the information that I provided earlier in the context of the solemn or serious criminal caseload, which in Aberdeen in 11-12 was 389. That's now come down to 309. It's true to say that there were programming arrangements where Aberdeen business was routed to Stonehaven. What I can say now is that the Aberdeen court programme, under the direction of the Sheriff Principal, has actually been redesigned to make sure that Aberdeen can properly accommodate its own caseload and the caseload coming in from Stonehaven.
As I understand it, and as we were told on Monday evening at a public meeting, 60 solemn cases were transferred just only very recently. So it's obviously not solved yet. Aberdeen's also the designated...
I'm not aware of 60 cases being transferred recently from Aberdeen to Stonehaven. I am aware of a revised Aberdeen programme which can accommodate the combined level of business.
And does that take into account the fact that Aberdeen's the designated court for health and safety claims in relating to offshore issues, which of course can lead to very long cases that come in?
It does take full account of that, and we do factor into programming a possible situation where a long-running trial, proof, inquiry can actually require a number of court sitting days. So it is factored into the plans.
One of the other things that's concerned me particularly is the lack of a detailed equality impact assessment, and I believe that many of the proposals round about Stonehaven and indeed Arbroath will impact significantly on children and on vulnerable witnesses. Can you explain why the equality impact assessment hasn't yet been completed?
First of all, I can confirm that the equality impact has in fact been completed, and well, it will be on the website in early course. As to this, it will be. It has been completed and it will be published. It will be published within, I would say, just a number of days. But we have carried out the impact. Now we've carried out the impact at the national level and we have also carried out the impact at the level of each court which is closing. Now, we've taken into account a range of considerations. One of them, as you rightly say, applies to the impact there may be on people who have to travel, for example. Another impact relates to the level of service provision between the courts that are closing and the courts that are receiving that business. And we have made an assessment that in the context of courts receiving business, because of their size and because of various other factors, they're actually better able to provide for children and other vulnerable witnesses in that set of circumstances.
Okay, that's quite the opposite to what we've certainly heard at public meetings. I've been told that the facilities for family court cases in Aberdeen is absolutely dire. Can you tell me what the arrangements are for children in Arbroath compared to Forfar at the moment?
If you'll just bear with me, I can certainly get that.
Can I just say, while we're waiting, that I know there's people wanting with supplementaries, but I'm going to go through the list to let everybody in, because you may be taking some. So I've got John, Sandra, Jenny, Nigel, Roderick and Graham in that order, okay? So just take a note where you are. Sorry, right, so found your spot now. Yeah.
The position between Arbroath and Forfar is such that currently the level of provision in comparing one against the other would not, I would say, be substantially better in Forfar. The position, though, in Forfar is such that there are potential opportunities within the building of Forfar Sheriff Court in relation to improvements to accommodation which don't currently exist in Arbroath. Now, those opportunities will be taken and will be developed to ensure that Forfar provides a fully fit-for-purpose set of facilities and provision for all witnesses, including vulnerable witnesses.
Cross our fingers and hope for the best, whereas at the moment in Arbroath we have good facilities for vulnerable witnesses.
Come in and just add there, it's not cross your fingers and hope for the best. Part of our original ideas were to move the business from Forfar into Dundee. The very strong feeling coming from the Angus community was they would prefer to see an option where there was one combined court in Angus. We had to take a view in terms of the facilities at both these courts, and Arbroath is in a very cramped site. It's quite a lot of rabbit-warren type facilities internally. Its issues about custody and custody management and health and safety are serious issues which are not straightforward to address. Our view is that Forfar offers us much more potential. There's more space available, there's more room to expand, so we have committed to make an investment in Forfar to deliver a court that will provide the standard for the people of Angus.
And what time scale is that? What time scale is that?
There's no question about that at all. That's work that we will take forward and we are taking forward as soon as a decision is made by Parliament to go down that direction.
And,
so we are currently working up plans, and we have money set aside in the capital budget this year to take that work forward.
Okay.
So it is certainly not a cross your fingers and hope.
And the situation in Aberdeen, where I'm told that the room for family court is next to the cells, and that there is nowhere for people to have proper meetings.
I think there's two issues there. There is one issue that we have been very clear about, and that is about upgrading the accommodation in Aberdeen Sheriff Court. And I say part of our plans have been about trying to acquire additional space from the council. Those are negotiations that are going on. We're also looking at opportunities now that the police are moving about trying to make additional use of their building in Aberdeen, and it might even be that we can manage a situation, which I think would be the ideal one, that we create a separate area for the civil business to be done in Aberdeen. So there are plans that are getting developed to vastly improve the accommodation facility in Aberdeen. There are funds that are part of our capital budget this year, and as soon as we get the right property solution, whether it's through the police accommodation or whether it's through the council accommodation, we'll take that forward and put it in place. We've heard a lot of comments about meetings taking place in corridors. That is not something that we would support, and that is not something we would propose as being a solution. There are solicitors from time to time who will use that as the way of doing their business. We don't provide facilities in our courts for solicitors to do their business with clients. That's work that should be done in advance before they come to court. And when they come to court, we should have the right facilities for a court hearing to take place for that children and family business. And that's what we have in Aberdeen. So we recognise that there are some difficulties with accommodation, but part of it is about the way it's used. But part of it is about our development plans to improve overall what we have in Aberdeen.
You're asking us to accept that we're going to close efficient courts that are working well, that have some space in them for the business to be done properly. By your own admission, at the best possible scenario is that we're going to have a transitional phase where things are really cramped, really awkward, and we promised some jam tomorrow when you cope.
That's what I'm suggesting at all.
Well,
I mean, I think what we are suggesting is that we will make investment in those courts where we recognise that there are accommodation difficulties, and Aberdeen are forfeit are 2 of those courts, and we've been quite clear about that. And those investments will be made, and they will be delivered by the time that those courts are combined.
With a reducing capital budget that you've got?
Yep, we already have funds set aside for that.
I'll let someone else.
Just now, John, followed by Sandra.
Thank you, Convener. I've got a couple of general questions and a couple of questions which affect my own area in the Borders. Firstly, in your analysis, you state that around 95% of consultees disagreed with your proposals for closing sheriff and JP courts. How many would have to have disagreed for you to have changed your mind?
I'm not sure that's quite a rhetorical question or not. It is a difficulty with consultations. I mean, this is a very difficult issue. There's a lot of sentiment, there's a lot of emotion, and a lot of people attach a high value to their local court service. Their preference, quite clearly, would be to keep a court in the local area, and we can understand that. But what we are trying to deal with here is a world where there is going to be significant changes to the justice system as we see it today, and there are going to be significant pressures on public sector funding that we just can't get away from. And if you look at every local authority across Scotland, they are changing their service delivery, they are looking at various consultations on closing schools or closing nurseries. The courts are no different from that. We don't live within a world where we are somehow protected. And what we are trying to do with the resources that are available to us is to put in place the best possible court system that will meet the needs of court users, deliver access to justice and be affordable in the long term. So we're not surprised that in terms of the individual issues of individual courts, there is a lot of concern about it. Yep, people, yes, would rather see another court. What nobody's coming forward is a sensible alternative to how we deal with that situation. There has been a lot of talk about using technology more, moving to case management, and these are things that we see as critical part of the future. We don't see them as being an either or. So this is about redesigning the court system, but also it's about making use of technology that limits the amount of time that people have to come to court, about trying to do as much electronically as we can, and about trying to have as widespread a video conferencing network to try to alleviate as much as possible the travel difficulties. And these things are not easy to balance.
So is it fair to say the consultation was simply a tick-boxing exercise? You had already made up your mind, you went through a process simply to tick the right boxes?
Absolutely not. I think what I've identified already is changes that we've made constantly throughout the process of the initial dialogue events, through to the consultation, and the work that we will now be doing with those different organisations to think in the future how we can best redesign services with a new environment that are going to meet their needs.
In the consultation document, you included various tables which included information about the caseloads for the various courts, but for some reason you didn't include figures for the JP courts where they shared the same premises, the same building as the Sheriff Court, and these figures came later. Was that a deliberate omission?
Sorry, when you say they came later?
Well, the figures were eventually, I requested the figures for the JP courts where they shared the same, I'm thinking of my own constituency in Duns, where the Sheriff Court shares the same premises as the JP court. In your consultation document, the caseload data did not include those figures.
Right. Yes, we provide that information later, and yes, we provided it in our consultation response document.
But it wasn't in the initial consultation, is my point, and I'm asking you if that was deliberate.
To be honest, I'm not actually sure. Yeah, perhaps it was an oversight, and honestly, when the consultation went out, there's nothing that we have been trying to hide from this at all. I mean, we've been trying absolutely open, transparent in terms of maintaining our integrity. And whenever we've been asked for any supplementary information, we've provided that information. We've tried to make sure that it's reflected as full as we possibly can within our consultation document.
Okay. Turning to the borders now, Dun Sheriff Court in my own constituency has last year heard just over 330 cases, and it's been identified for closure, with the bulk of that casework going to Jedburgh Court. I wondered if you could describe to me how my constituent who doesn't have access to a car will get to an early morning hearing in Jedburgh if he lives in Eyemouth.
I mean, Duns, we fully understand, is one of the courts where some of the travel issues will be the most difficult. Yep, and that is partly about the limitation of public transport within that area. But at the same time, we have to balance that against the amount of cases that actually proceed at any given time in Dun Sheriff Court. On average, there is 0.3 of a summary trial that proceeds on a weekly basis. There are no sheriff and jury trials that proceed in Duns. There's 0.2 a week of a JP trial that actually proceeds. So the level of business that are going through these courts is very, very small. We accept for some people that the actual travel distance to Jedburgh in the future will be difficult. And by public transport, you are looking at a time approaching 2 hours for that public transport difficulty. But what we can't do is provide court services to meet every single issue across the whole of Scotland. What we try to do is to be proportionate in what we are delivering. And for the very, very small level of business, we accept that for some of those individuals in certain locations within that Sheriff Court district will have a journey time which can be considered to be quite long.
Do you also accept in some cases some people have to stay overnight to allow them to be in the court in time for an early morning appointment?
That may be possible. I mean, what we will do and what we have committed to doing in all of these areas is to work with Crown through their victim support team to adjust where we possibly can the court starting and finishing times to accommodate people's travelling needs. So if by travelling by public transport means that they arrive there at 11 o'clock or 11:30 rather than 10 o'clock, then we will readjust the timing of their case for that specific nature. Where there are real travelling difficulties and where if a case is carrying on for a few days there may be a need for people to stay overnight, that is an arrangement that the Crown will come to with those individuals.
And the cost of that will be picked up by?
And the cost of that will be picked up by the Crown for those witnesses.
Right.
Picked up by Crown. What happens in civil cases?
Yeah.
Sorry?
What happens in civil cases?
In civil cases where it's legal aid, that's covered by legal aid.
So they'll pick up costs?
Legal aid board will pick
If
up costs for
legal aid.
where it's legal aided cases.
If they have it?
Yeah.
If they don't have legal aid?
If they don't have legal aid, that would be part of their expenses if they're successful in one of the
So it's an extra cost. So whilst the court service is saving money, victims and witnesses are potentially having to pay more.
But again, if we look at the level of civil cases in Duns, it is going to be very small and very marginal.
But for those people affected, it's quite a significant impact.
Yes, but on average, there's about one civil case registered at Duns per week. You can only work out what that is going to result in terms of proofs. So the percentage of people that would be required to have additional costs and stay overnight really is going to be down into the very small decimal places.
My last question, just about the borders again, is about justice centres. We've heard a bit about justice centres, and I just wondered if you could expand a bit more on what exactly that proposal entails and what the timetable is for delivering justice centres, particularly in the context of the borders.
I mean, part of what we're trying to do in setting out our ideas for future court structures is just not all the bad news about cuts and reductions. Part of this is trying to think a bit more creatively of how the justice system should look in the future. And we have been quite open and clearly identified in our response document that we see justice centres as being quite an integral part to support the courts that we have in many of our larger cities. And we have looked at the Borders, Highlands, Fife and an area of Strathclyde as being potential candidates where we would like to see a justice centre. Now, by a justice centre, we mean much more than a court building. We see it being the type of service that is provided alongside the Scottish Court Service, alongside the police with their custody units, with the Crown Office, with social work, with victim support, with the actual support services we need, where there is a volume of business that makes that worthwhile having. We have committed to undertaking feasibility studies in each of those four areas, and we have funds set aside for doing that this year. The first one in the Borders, the meeting will be the week after next, where we're having an initial scoping meeting to get agreement on the principle of a justice centre and the principle of taking forward a feasibility study. There's already a suggestion that in terms of location, Galashiels would make a good central hub within the Borders area, and to us it would be a good model of trying to keep all the Borders cases and maintaining Borders identity within the Borders. So we are very committed to it as a way of trying to improve the justice system, improve delivery. And I say we will be sitting down with partners in the council and justice colleagues in a week after next to start scoping out the feasibility and the practicality of trying to achieve them.
If you'll forgive me, because we've moved on to my patch, I'll just come in here with a supplementary here. We already have a justice centre in the Borders and Peebles Sheriff Court, which, as you know, was threatened with closure under the previous executive, and moved into Rosetta Road, has the police there, they're just through the door, has social work, has child welfare, and as far as I know has very, very small running costs because it's not even owned by the Scottish Court Service. So do we not already have one? And, you know, what are the advantages from somebody moving, just as John's constituency, I've got somebody in Broughton, say, that has now to get, and I welcome at least it would be Selkirk, but somebody's got to get from Broughton to Selkirk instead of from Broughton to Peebles.
To be fairly blunt, Peebles could be a good model for a justice centre. It simply doesn't have the business. So there is not the sufficiency of business in Peebles to justify operating that as a full-time border centre.
So bear with me. If you're talking about Justice Centre in Gala, which is taking the business from Peebles, why is the business not just staying in Peebles and developing that site? It's got great parking round about it. It's, you know, it's easy access. It's pretty good area to travel to. So if we already have the place, what's wrong with using it? Making that the Justice Centre?
If that was the view of people on the Borders, that was an easy access journey and that was accessible across the whole of the Borders, and that will come out as that'll come out as part of the feasibility study. Sorry,
the whole of the Borders. So what's the plan?
Well, the plan is to do a feasibility study across...
No, what's the plan? You said the whole of the Borders.
No, the plan is to do a feasibility study in terms of whether a justice centre could serve the whole of the Borders. So we will be looking with partners.
So all the other courts will close?
That's something we'll consider as part of the feasibility study.
I have to ask you that because that's where you're taking us.
And that's exactly why we'll have a feasibility study. What we've said is we will look at the feasibility study of having a court in the Borders. Now, I don't think, I mean, although people seem surprised around the table, I don't think anybody for 1 minute would imagine that this is a justice centre plus, in a sense. Yeah? So this is actually trying to look at how do we best deliver justice in the Borders in terms of having one central hub that is your main part where you deliver that business. So yes, we will be looking wide across the Borders in terms of what's the ideal model.
Yeah, no, well, I've got piles of people coming in on this now, so I think, yes, wait a minute. Can I just let Sandra in and then I'll let others? And I've come in very briefly because I felt I can't let just Peebles go by, if you forgive me. It's Sandra, then I'll let everybody else come in later about justice centres. If you're happy with that, let's get through the people on the list. Sandra, then Jenny, be very patient.
Thank you, Vina, and good morning, gentlemen. My understanding that the proposals of the restructuring of the court system, but obviously we're taking the evidence from, is one of a measure of reforms throughout the justice system, such as the Victim and Witnesses Bill. And I think it's got to be looked in that particular aspect of it. I see you nodding your head, so I see you're agreeing with me. There's two particular issues I wanted to raise, and then maybe another issue. You mentioned in your answer to John Finney regarding the video links, and bearing in mind that this is a 10-year programme, you mentioned that video linking in the court restructure, if it goes forward, is a guarantee that video linking will be there. Can I take that as an absolute guarantee? And is there a timescale where this could be implemented?
The timescale we will come back to you on. The absolute guarantee is that we will have a complete network of VideoLink to make it accessible for victims and witnesses across Scotland. We already have comprehensive coverage in the moment in terms of every court is kitted out with video equipment, and we have 20 remote sites across Scotland. What we are committing to is to expand on that further, initially in the areas where we will take forward court closures. And that is a commitment that we can give quite clearly. We have funding set aside for that, and if these proposals are accepted, we will be working with partners in those areas to deliver it. As we look further into the forthcoming Victims and Witness Bill, we will be looking at other ways of trying to expand that service to make it more accessible to others. So there is no doubt or question at all about our commitment to try to make the maximum use of video links, particularly for those types of witnesses.
Thank you for that. The other issue which was raised by other members, and obviously with the emails and letters that we've all received, was regarding travel. And, you know, obviously victims and perpetrators travelling on the same mode of transport. Would it be the case that in certain circumstances, perhaps exceptional, I don't know, if there was a particular vulnerable witness, would the courts or the sheriff be able to basically say that they would provide alternative form of transport? Would that be, you know, would that be allowed if the lawyer said this particular person was vulnerable? Would it be up to the sheriff or the judge to say they could have a particular form of transport?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's actually in place at the moment and is managed by the Crown Office. So the Crown do have facilities at the moment to assess individual needs, to assess the requirements of vulnerable witnesses. And they can, and they do at the moment, put in additional or different types of travelling support. At times that can involve taxis, it can involve overnight stays, where a risk assessment's been carried out and they think it's a case that they should support. So that's something that is in there, and I think in the Crown Office's submission responding to the Justice Committee in terms of call to evidence, they have again confirmed that that is something they do at the moment, and it is something that they will maintain in the future.
Further question, Convener, thank you. It's been mentioned by people, obviously, they have a loyalty to the historic courts or in their local communities, but it's been mentioned in evidence here and yourself in your submission when you mentioned about sheriffs' sitting times and underutilisation of certain, you know, courts. Could you perhaps expand on that particular one? I mean, certainly some folk have said to me that in certain cases a sheriff will turn up at a court and they're sitting there for 2 days and there's no cases go forward. I just wanted could you expand on that particular part for me? How much, I know it's not about cost because you did say that in your first submission, it's about access to justice and court restructure. Does that go on a lot then when sheriffs are sitting there and
I wouldn't like to suggest that sheriffs are sitting about doing nothing, but I mean, it is quite clear that in certain of our courts, absolutely, and that's why I'm not suggesting that. But I mean, it is quite clear that a number of the courts, they are not fully occupied. Yeah, so we have looked particularly at those courts that were classed as low-volume courts that sit less than 3 days a week, and is it an effective use of the taxpayers' money to have those courts essentially available 5 days a week when sometimes we're using them a day or 2 days or 3 days, where we have capacity within other courts where we can move that business into. And you know, while we have talked about some of the accommodation problems and the plans we have at Aberdeen and Forfar, in the other courts then we have ample capacity to simply move that business into it. So part of this is actually about where we best use taxpayers' money and we take some of the underutilisation out of the equation and actually use our courts on a full basis that we, the taxpayers, would expect those to be used for.
Just one last question, Chair, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Can I just say to the committee, I'm going to have to extend this session a bit longer and then we'll have a little break before the next session because I've still got Jenny, Nigel, Roderick, Graham, Alison and Lewis with short questions.
Yeah, this...
I beg your pardon? Sorry.
Just one last question then, which is, I think most of my questions have been quite brief, actually. We're talking about the court structure and, you know, basically restructuring these courts. Now, when we had witnesses in for the Victim and Witnesses Bill, when Kate Higgins from Children's First, I think it was Jenny Marrett had raised the question about court closures and how accessible it would be for child witnesses. And Children First did say that some of the courts were not fit for purpose in that aspect of it. Now, bearing in mind this is a 10-year programme we're looking at here, I know you can't give me guarantees over 10 years, but what would be the timescale to make these courts, if this goes ahead, basically fit for purpose, the courts that we're talking about?
It's difficult to give precise timescales on these things, so it's quite clear that depends on the availability of future funding. Our aim at the moment is to make sure that all of our courts will meet the basic requirements, and the monies that we have set aside already to develop our courts as a result of these plans that we're taking forward will make sure that all of our courts meet at least the minimum standard. What we hope is part of the rationale behind this in future years is that by continuing to target our investment on a smaller number of courts, we can actually continue to roll out improvement plans to improve the facilities rather than just simply trying to keep buildings wind and watertight, which a lot of the time, because of restrictions in capital budget, we're actually doing at the moment. Now, a very good example of how that works is that we closed the JP Court in Glasgow last September. A site that people told us there was no value in, a site that people told us would be very difficult to solve. We concluded a deal on that last month for £1 million, which is capital investment that comes into the court service. We are now looking to use that £1 million to significantly improve a lot of those facilities. That's where some of the funding for the quick rollout of the Very Constant facilities across the courts that we will be closing is going to come from. So it's a very good example of actually what we want to achieve through the court structures about reducing the court stay, receiving investment that we can immediately deploy to improve the facilities, while at the same time reducing the actual running costs of the JP Court in Glasgow. Now, that's at the same time, so it doesn't bring the same travel difficulties. So I'm not trying to suggest that that's necessarily a typical example, but I think it is a good example of actually how we see this working in the future, that we will get a capital injection from any sales to immediately invest, but also will reduce the running costs, which allows us to make continual improvements.
Thank you, Sheila.
Jenny, and then followed by Nigel.
Thanks, Convener. Are the court closures compliant with the EU directive on victims and witnesses?
Are you suggesting they're not? Or?
I'm asking if they are.
Our understanding is that they will be, yes.
Has that been part of your assessment of the proposals?
I'll get back to you on that. I mean, I have no doubt. First of all, there are 2 points. First of all, whether or not as a specific measure there was a line-by-line assessment carried out against that, and that's what I'll have to come back to you on in terms of specification. The one thing that I would say, though, to be absolutely clear in this, is that we have looked at every protected characteristic in the context of equality impact assessment, and we have satisfied ourselves against that criteria.
Impact assessment hasn't yet been published.
No, sorry, yes.
You said in an answer to a question earlier, a quality impact assessment you would assume would be done before proposals are laid, but the equality impact assessment has not yet been published, so I don't know how you can rely on that.
The equality impact assessment has been completed and will be published.
Will be published, okay. So, can you clarify for me if the court closure proposals have been assessed against the EU directive on victims and witnesses? Okay.
I know that just let me clarify this. The court closures have been assessed against the requirements of equality impact assessments and the extent to which they bear on the interests of vulnerable groups.
Because the problem we've got at the moment is there's a bill currently going through this Parliament to protect victims and witnesses within the courts. And that's been brought to this Parliament because there's an EU directive to protect victims and witnesses. But concurrently, we've got this proposal for court closures, which could see victims and witnesses travelling together to the courts. So we've got protection going through this Parliament while victims and witnesses are together within our court buildings, but we've got a proposal to put them together while they're on their way there. So I think we need to know if these proposals are compliant with the directive.
What I can say is that the proposals took full account of the potential impact on witnesses travelling. So the answer to that one is yes. As far as the Victims and Witnesses Bill is concerned, again, we are aware of the provisions of the Victims and Witnesses Bill, and organisationally we are taking all appropriate steps to make sure that we can embrace the needs which are represented in that legislation for vulnerable groups.
There are victim support organisations that believe it's not compliant, but I'll leave that with you. Maybe you can come back to us on that. On the savings point, you said in an answer to a question earlier about Arbroath and Forfar that there would be opportunities in Forfar in the future to provide, you said, fit-for-purpose facilities for families and vulnerable witnesses. What cost implication will that have? How much will that cost?
The initial cost implications for Falkirk that we're looking at in terms for Forfar, that we're looking at the plans at the moment are around £100,000.
Okay. But the projected savings by closing Arbroath Court is £125,000. So that £100,000 that you will have to spend on facilities in Forfar cancels out your savings by closing Arbroath Court.
In the first year, yeah.
Just in the first year. But we were told that the £125,000 savings is projected savings over 5 to 10 years.
Sorry,
From
the
your
actual,
document.
if you just give me a second, the actual savings for now that's the actual annual figure savings for closing Arbroath Sheriff Court.
Okay, but that saving will be wiped out by just one piece of expenditure on Forfar Sheriff Court.
And that sounds like a pretty good long-term investment, yeah.
But that's not to account for, I mean, we talked about alternative modes of transport. I believe there's to be an increased use of taxis for witnesses and victims to court, is that right?
Yeah, I think what we're in danger, if you just give me a second, I think we're in danger of mixing up some different things here. We have carried out quite a detailed business case in terms of the costs and in terms of the savings. Yeah, so to me, £100 investment in Forfar is actually a very good investment if you're going to be saving £100,000 on an annual recurring basis. So if you look at over either a 6 or a 10-year period, you're going to be significantly better off by having made that move. The question of additional costs for witnesses is one that is borne by the Crown Office. Now, the Crown Office have done quite some detailed analysis, postcode analysis of where witnesses travel from, in terms of what the implications could be, and their view is that that can be contained within their existing budgets. So the costs of additional witness travel are not picked up by the Crown, but they're by the Court Service, but they're picked up by the Crown Office. The Crown Office view is that this is quite minimal, and in terms of the overall improvement programme they're making for witness attendance and witness travel, they don't see any significant issues, and in fact they project that there might be likely savings as some of those improvements start to come through.
So these closures do have an impact on other budgets. It's a saving from your budget, from the Scottish Court Service, but it's an increase of expenditure in the Crown Office budget.
It's
and
a
other
potential
budgets.
increase, and what I have said is that the Crown Office have looked at this in quite detail, doing a postcode analysis, and their view is that it could be contained within their existing budget.
What about the civil legal aid budget? What about civil cases?
We've had exactly the same discussion with the Legal Aid Board, who have carried out their own assessment, and in terms of the reforms that are coming through, they think there are actually the potential to make some savings. Yep, so this is the independent assessment that's been carried out by the Crown Office, by the Legal Aid Board, by Police Scotland, in terms of what the impact is going to be. And these organisations are saying that they fully support the recommendations we're taking forward. They see opportunities to make an operational improvement for those organisations, and that any cost increase that's attached will be negated by those savings, so therefore the impact on their budget will be negligible.
Ms McQueen, my final point on this. I mean, I think there is a lot of confusion. The public meetings have been to how these costs stack up. And indeed, Lewis MacDonald put to you earlier an assessment that was done by forensic accountants. Now, I know you didn't agree with that assessment, but it seems to me that there's so much confusion about how these savings add up and the implication on other budgets that it would perhaps be a good exercise to do a much more in-depth cost analysis across all budgets on these proposed closures.
Yep. And I would say in fairness that we have already done that. I mean, I think we have been very clear in the reports that we've put out about the potential costs and savings that circulate around the court services. We have had very clear discussions with the police, with the Crown Office, with the Legal Aid Board about potential implications for their budget, and they have assured us from their financial assessment that this will be largely court neutral, or in some cases the opportunities to promote savings because of some of those organisational changes. Now, I'm not sure how more clear we can be in that particular area.
I think it would be quite useful for the committee if you allow me, Jenny, to write to the police, the Crown and Legal Aid Board to confirm the position. I'm testing your evidence. Obviously, we'd be testing. I think that'd be a way. We don't really have time, unfortunately, to have a panel with them before us. But I think it'd be useful to, once the OR's out, is to write and confirm the position.
Thank you, Convener. Just to say it would be good if you could come back to us on the EU directive. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Nigel, then Roderick, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm wondering if I could pick up on the... I have two Sheriff Courts, of course, here. Mercifully, you're not proposing to close both of them, or my life would be quite intolerable. But the point about Forfar, which is staying open, it would appear in preference to Arbroath, does at least mean I'm keeping one. can I just point out, I think the transport issues are very real, but I think they're not just in the context of the court service. I think actually transport across the north of Angus is actually a serious problem. It's a drum I've been banging for a while. If I could then just go on to Stonehaven, could I make the point to our witnesses that to some extent this is a matter of civic pride? Stonehaven folk just do not want to lose their court. It is part of the structure. It's been there for centuries. It's part of what you do. And in that context, could I ask you to talk, one, about that, but also what assessment you've made of the economic effect on the town, please?
Okay, in terms of civic pride, it's a difficult thing. I mean, I can't just wash away people's views of civic pride with a set of numbers or a set of clever answers. It is something that's been around for a long time. It is the heritage of that community. But at the same time, we are in a very different world now. We are in a world where the public sector doesn't have the funding that it's had in past years. And we are in a world where there will be radical changes to the justice system and radical improvements in terms of technology, in terms of how we deliver the service in the future. So while on one notion it's nice to hang on to the pride and the passion and the commitment that people had to these buildings, we have to realise that the justice system is actually not about buildings. It's about people. And if there's a different way that we can provide that service and meet it through technological needs, then I think that's the direction the justice system is going in the future.
Could I put it to you, and I take your words precisely, that it's not just about buildings, it is about people, that the loss of the court will actually have an effect on the high street lawyers, on the ability of folk within Stonehaven and the surrounding area actually to have access to their own lawyers, because if the business is all up the road in Aberdeen, then it's far less likely that lawyers will actually stay in the high street.
Yeah. I mean, equally, I'm quite sure if there's people in Stonehaven that require access to legal facilities, then there will be legal services that will be provided. That's part in supply and demand of the legal market. And I'm quite sure there will be more than enough solicitors to provide that advice and take the business from clients that live in that particular area. You mentioned the issue about the impact on towns and communities, and it's something which has been raised in a lot of the consultations. What we are very clear about is that we are not losing jobs as a result of this. We are moving jobs. So there will be no redundancies. There will be no loss of posts caused by this. People will move from their work location at the moment to a new location. In the very much vast majority of cases, people will still continue to live and be employed in whatever area they currently live in at all. So this is not about taking jobs out of the community. The thing that I find really interesting in comparison is when we look at a lot of the local authority plans for this year, and we look at a lot of changes to their services and a whole amount of voluntary redundancies and job cuts taking place. I think actually there's an argument there's much more significant challenges for the viability of the community. And it does seem a bit odd that the focus has been put on the court service, who in some cases are simply moving a job 20 miles and not actually losing that job, when some authorities may have programmes that are involving reducing staff numbers by 75 or 130 next year. And it does kind of put in perspective what we are trying to achieve with these proposals.
I think I understand what you're saying there. Could I just finally then just go back to the previous issue about the capacity of the Aberdeen courts to take what the business from Stonehaven, which we've largely explored. But I think your answers, if I've heard them right, are suggesting that you need to spend a certain amount of money and do a certain amount of organising in Aberdeen to be able to receive that business. Now, according to the draft I've got in front of me, the proposal is, in this particular case, that we close the Stonehaven court on the 31st of May 2014. So you've only got 12 months to make the kind of changes and accommodations which I think you've spoken about. Are you confident that you can actually do that?
Yep, we're certainly confident that we can make any adaptations we need to accommodate the Stonehaven business in Aberdeen by that particular stage. Our longer term plans, and that will depend on trying to reach agreement either with the council or the police, will be about further expansion. Now that might run through as part of that period, but there is no doubt at all that we are absolutely assured, and the Sheriff Principal is absolutely assured, that we will have the right conditions in place in Aberdeen to deal with the business of Stonehaven when it transfers, if it transfers in May next year.
And that the JP Court would also, which we haven't spoken about much, JP Court, former district court, that will be able to cope with the business that's transferred from Stonehaven.
Absolutely, there's no doubt or question again about that.
That's not the view of the policeman on the door.
That's the view of the Sheriff Principal, who's done the detailed analysis of the court programming in Aberdeen.
I want to move on. I'm sorry. I've got Roddy, Graham, Alison and then Lewis. And I hope we can be swift and perhaps finish by 11. I think probably not by the look in the face there. Start with Roderick, please.
Morning again. In the interest of brevity, can I kind of adhere to the points that Nigel's made about Stonehaven in relation to Cooper and the history of the town, but I won't repeat the same question. In the consultation responses, a number of people have referred to the fact that in some areas which courts are scheduled for closure, the courts currently have close proximity with public agencies like the police and criminal social work departments. I don't see that that point's really been taken over in your response published last month. Any comments on that and the fact that that doesn't seem to be in a particularly relevant consideration going forward?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure.
The point is proximity. Where courts are scheduled for closure, some of these areas have public agencies such as the police and criminal social work located right next to the existing courts. So, but that doesn't seem to be a factor in your assessment of where we go with your proposals.
Yeah, and sometimes where that's located, that's helpful to have. I mean, if we look at Cooper, for example, if the Cooper business moves to Dundee, it will not change the responsibilities of the social worker within the North Fife area. So they will still be responsible for the pre-court disposals, they will still be responsible for the social work services in the same way as they are at the moment. The only difference is that that case will actually be proceeding in Dundee Sheriff Court. And one of the things that we will be looking at is actually trying to minimise the amount of travel and requirement for social workers to move to court. The vast majority of the social work information to courts is through written reports rather than personal appearance. And in many cases, that's actually already what exists at the moment. So there will be people in the north east of Fife that are currently prosecuted in Dundee or any other court in Scotland. And already there's arrangements in place to make sure the social work operates effectively. We don't see that fundamentally changing, and we think through technology there might actually be beneficial ways to reduce some of the travel that might be involved or of some of the attendance that's actually involved in place at the moment.
Have you had any discussions with Fife Social Criminal Work Department?
We've only had some limited discussions in terms of the consultation responses and discussions that we had with them through the dialogue events.
No recent discussions with them at all?
Not recent discussions, no.
Okay. One of the problems with these proposals is that for most people, certainly in my part of the world, it's difficult to sell this as an improvement to justice and access to justice for them. And what I take it as a thread through the consultation is that we're saying that for a relatively small number of people, they will be disadvantaged on the comparatively rare occasions they come in to dealings with the court. I mean, how would you sell it to people in my part of the world where they see justice being removed lock, stock and barrel, not only at kind of sheriff and jury level, but at summary level and in the proposals for summary sheriffs going forward? How do you sell that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it's about removing it lock, stock and barrel, but it's actually about trying to deliver it in a different way in the future. I mean, for the people of North East Fife, then yes, for some of them, there will be some extra travel involved. So people from Cooper, if they travel to Dundee, will have an additional journey of, I think it's about 25 minutes on the train. For the vast majority of the people live in St Andrews and those further out areas, the difference in public transport time is actually just a matter of minutes. I think it's about 7 minutes more to get the bus to Dundee than it is to Cooper. So I think we've got to be realistic about what we're trying to achieve here. For the vast majority of people, in particular in that area, the additional travel distances are not significant. What we will be able to do is to offer a level of service in Dundee and a continued investment in Dundee that will provide very, very good facilities. What we will be able to do is to put technology in place so we can bring in electronic case management, we can have electronic presentation of evidence, we can reduce the amount of witnesses that need to attend court in the future. So this is not just about taking today's system and lifting it up and dropping it somewhere else, but actually is about trying to give us the capacity to have the investment to get the benefit out of all the justice reforms that are coming our way.
For 44% of the people, they will be required to travel more than 10 miles more than at the present time. And just moving on to kind of family child welfare hearings, particularly for those kind of hearings, 80% of people having to travel further to deal with those kind of issues, those are kind of really local issues. How is the new setup going to improve life for child welfare hearings?
Again, it's a question of balance, a question of numbers, and a question of the facilities and the services which are available, first of all in the receiving courts and then in the wider context of court reforms. Now, in the context of selling the argument, as you put it, the important point here is that from a Scotland's justice perspective, there has to be a better way, and we cannot carry on with a configuration of courts which was actually set up for a 17th and 19th century time frame. The visionary perspective for Scotland's justice system is, as we've described, and that is that we combine the best that we possibly can through specialisation where it's appropriate and necessary, and the operation of a network of courts capitalising on technology. Now, I can understand that that's not the easiest sell to the individual who will rightly have concerns as to the impact in the local community context, but I think it's very important to keep that perspective in mind. As far as child welfare hearings, for example, are concerned, I can say that the facilities in Dundee are far, far better than the facilities in Cooper. I can also say, for example, in the context of Haddington, which is a useful example, where the child welfare hearings will be convened in Edinburgh within a specialist family court role. So we have to bear in mind there are a number of checks and balances around this. It's not all measured singly by the localised or isolated circumstances. There is a vision for a better way, and this is our platform for enabling that vision to be realised. The corollary of that is realising that vision will be far, far more difficult, if at all possible, if we are tied to the configuration of buildings and the expenditure lines that denotes for us.
Could I just refer you to something in the September consultation which continues to puzzle me? You refer to specialist justice centres, and then you move on to talk about the wider network of smaller facilities. This is paragraph 2.12, which could range from a complex of courts served by resident members of the judiciary to small sitting centres for courts to be held by visiting members of the judiciary. Accommodation could be shared with other public services. And also that's kind of referred to also in paragraph 2.43, where you talk about kind of access opportunities to share accommodation with other public bodies. Could you, that doesn't seem to have been followed through in the consultation response. There doesn't seem to be any reference to the circumstances in which there would be visiting members of the judiciary hearing things. Could you just
where that will carry on in the future is in our island and our remote courts. So we have committed to the fact that that business in the island courts will still be carried out by a sheriff, and there will be sheriffs that will visit those courts to carry out the more serious cases that they have jurisdiction for in the future. In the same way, we have said that the move to sheriff and jury business will be a 10-year plan. It's a direction of travel. If in the interim time summary sheriffs come in, then sheriffs will still go out to those small courts to hear sheriff and jury cases. They will still go out to those small courts to hear the more complex business, pending a move or a direction of travel towards the justice centres, or the specialist sheriff centres. So there will still be a model as we try to work through these proposals where there will be a need for both. And even as we move to the sheriff and jury centres, if indeed that's the way we go, the sheriff principals have always been quite clear that they will retain the right where they think there's an issue that is important to local access to justice, where a sheriff and jury trial will be held in one of those smaller court areas. So what we aren't saying is that that will never happen, but what we are saying is that what we'd like to see is a model where there are specialist sheriff centres, but sheriff principals will always retain the right where there's a need for local access to justice to decree that a sheriff should go to that particular area. So none of this is exclusive, and that same position is true in terms of the High Court. We are saying that the High Court should predominantly sit in a smaller number of centres, the Lord President and the Lord Advocate will always have the right to decree that a trial should be held at a local court. So that model is one that will be flexible throughout all the way we go forward.
In terms of the summary sheriffs moving forward, and I appreciate consultation on that still open, but are you considering, will you take on board kind of the possibility of summary sheriffs moving from, moving out in the community on a more wider basis, particularly in rural parts of Scotland?
See summary sheriffs based, and obviously the consultation is still out at the moment and there's still modelling work going on. But we would see summary sheriffs being based in virtually every court across Scotland. I would find it hard to find a model where you would have a courthouse where you wouldn't have a summary sheriff. I think what we will see is a greater concentration of sheriffs in the more specialist centres. And I think that's where sheriff principals will retain the decision occasionally to move them out to specific courts. But in terms of summary sheriffs, then it's hard to see a model where they wouldn't exist in every court throughout Scotland.
Okay, I'll leave it at there.
I don't want to close down questions. I do want to finish by 11. So what I'm going to suggest, if I have the questions from Graham and Alison and Lewis, and if we can get them done by 11, so be it. And I'm just going to get all the questions. If we can't, could you write to us, please, with the responses? Because we've really had an hour and a half, and I've got other witnesses waiting. Is that agreed? I know it's not the best, but we've had a good crack of the whip at lots of issues. So what's your question, Graham?
I think it follows on from one of the questions that Sandra White gave earlier about witnesses and victims travelling to courts, and special arrangements are going to be made for victims and witnesses. And I have to say, I smiled with the panel nodding in agreement that these arrangements could be made, but a future panel at the back shaking their heads saying no, that's not their experience. I would anticipate they'll say. The key of the question that I want to make is that victims and witnesses who gave evidence to this committee earlier, their experience was not one that was positive and was likely to engage them for the future in coming forward again. Across the south of Scotland, Duns, Haddington, Kirkcudbright, Peebles, a big change in the arrangements of courts for the south of Scotland. And you leave us... You leave us...
I made it sound like a presiding officer,
Indeed.
but come up with your question.
I'll give the question now. I had to set the context first. You asked us for this leap of faith, for this belief that you're going to be able to get it right. It's actually a leap of faith for the witnesses and victims. You're making a huge change here. How are we going to pick up on very, very vulnerable people who already feel under tremendous pressure and going to court to try and offer best evidence?
The question is, no, I want to get the question. So the question is, this makes it worse for vulnerable witnesses who already find it difficult to go to court. To summarise your question. Alison, what's your one?
I've got two points. Mr McQueen said earlier that the court service wasn't about buildings, it was about people, and I find that hard to reconcile with what Mr Binning said about Arbroath and Forfar. He acknowledged that the facilities were better for vulnerable witnesses in Arbroath, and yet you're going to move to Forfar. That seems to me it's only about the building. Did you take into account how many vulnerable witness orders there were in each of these courts when trying to come to that decision? The second point is about the sloughing off of costs onto other agencies and other people, and we've heard today about the Crown and the legal aid, victims and witnesses and criminal justice social work having to pick up some of the tabs. Another implication might be in Stonehaven that the police are unduly impacted by it. Currently the police station is co-located in the court. What discussion have you had with the police service about the future of that building?
So good questions about where, if we can extend it to where police co-locate in other courts as well through Scotland, not just to the one. And Lewis, briefly please.
Two factual questions, Convener, which I hope Mr McQueen can give us a yes or no answer to. In response to you earlier, Convener, he said that the feasibility study looking at establishing a justice centre in the borders may well result in a further proposal for the closure of further courts in the borders. So my first factual question is, are there other feasibility centres for the establishment of justice centres either being undertaken or in the planning, which may also result in the closure of courts such as, for example, Tain or Banff or other courts around Scotland? Right. And second factual question, again, straightforward yes or no question. Have you or have you not undertaken an economic impact assessment of the impact of closing courts in towns such as Stonehaven, Dingwall and Haddington, which are facing the closure of their local court.
Right, vulnerable witnesses will be worse off.
Sorry?
Vulnerable witnesses, one of the questions was, under these arrangements, vulnerable witnesses will be worse off with some of your proposals. Is
Okay,
that the case?
our answer to that is no. I think what was really helpful is to look at the Crown Office response to the submission. I think they're very clear in there about their commitment to vulnerable witnesses, and they're very clear about the provision that they will put in place for transport and liaison in those particular cases. So I think it's actually a very helpful response. I think if there's more you need on that, then certainly we're happy to assist. But that is primarily
Also about vulnerable witness orders, in particular, specific question.
Yep, the vulnerable witness orders, I think what we have accepted that there is a compromise in terms of moving to Forfar. What we are being very clear about is that we will improve the facilities at Forfar to make it the quality facilities that we should have for vulnerable witnesses.
And put it on the record, there were 66 vulnerable witness orders in Arbroath in 2010 and 5 in Forfar. In 2011 there were 47 in Arbroath and only 6 in Forfar. And you're flipping it all around.
And we will create the facilities in Forfar that will serve those vulnerable witnesses.
The facilities are already there.
I think, now, I have said 11 and I meant 11, and what we've still got other questions. We've got the OR, there were direct questions asked, and I would appreciate if you could respond to these to the committee in time for next week, if that's possible. Lewis, I do want to... The question which you can probably answer is the Borders proposal, which you said is looking at a justice centre, and the proposal would be that would be it, one centre for the Borders. Is this a model for other parts of Scotland?
Yep. We will be carrying out 3 further feasibility studies in Scotland, and we will be looking at the best configuration of courts to support a justice centre in that area. So yes, we will be doing the feasibility study, but the feasibility study will look at the level of provision that's actually required.
Right. So on other issues, please, because I am aware of the time, I've got other witnesses who've sat, I'm going to say that we'll have the rest of your responses, please, in writing to the questions that haven't been done, and I'm going to now suspend for 8 minutes. I don't see the point in having my boing as nobody pays any attention to it, but I'll just let you hear it again so you know next time. There we are. That does mean please take your seats, everybody. Right, can I welcome our second panel of witnesses who have sat through the evidence previously. Stuart Fair, Treasurer of the Scottish Justices Association, James Wolfe, QC, Vice Dean, Faculty of Advocates, Stuart Naismith, Convener, Access to Justice Committee, Law Society of Scotland, and Sheriff Drummond. And can I say that we, Sheriff Drummond did try to have other sheriffs come along, particularly to look at the aspects in rural areas, but unfortunately none were able to attend. So to make it plain, there's no partisan place in my having Sheriff Drummond here from the Borders area, but it was to give a perspective on rural Shrieval work. Can I go straight again to questions from members? John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. My first question relates to justice centres and the bombshell, in my opinion, which we heard in the previous session, which suggested that the court service is going to be reviewing more courts for closure with a view to setting up justice centres to cover much wider areas, and the example was given of the Borders. I wondered if you were aware of these further reviews and what your view is of it.
Now, can I just ask members of the panel to indicate to me if they wish to speak, and I'll call you. Sheriff Drummond.
I was appointed to the Borders in 2000, so for 13 years I've been presiding over the courts at Jedburgh, Selkirk, Duns and Peebles. And the prospect of another feasibility study for another justice centre is something which I've heard, but there was a feasibility study, as I understand it, just before I was appointed in 2000. Then there was a study carried out by Sheriff Principal Nicholson, which was the subject of a debate in this Parliament. That was in January 2000, the debate took place. And now we've had this consultation, and it is my understanding that the feasibility studies, such as they are disclosed, that the establishing of a central justice centre in the Borders still gives rise to the same travel difficulties as we have. And it has been conceded that particularly in relation to Eyemouth and the far side of Berwickshire, that there are significant travel difficulties. And my short, simple answer to the thing is, instead of having people travelling to a central court, you should have the sheriff travelling to the people. I have covered over 250,000, I may say, unpaid miles in the course of my 13 years in the Borders, and it seems to me better that I go to centres for the purpose of dealing with the business rather than the people should come to me. And the question really seems to me is, how do we best organise those locations in which that can happen? And Peebles is the classic, but we're going to close it.
Mr Naismith.
Yes, Stuart Naismith, Law Society of Scotland. If you took justice centres to their logical conclusion from the purpose of running a business, you would just have one centre where everybody goes. The fact is that justice centres of justice certainly do have a place, particularly in the central belt or the urban area of Scotland, but for rural areas they impact disproportionately. So as part of joined up thinking, there can certainly be a place for centres of justice, and by common consent, Livingston is a very good example of that. But it's not the be-all and end-all.
Anyone else wish to comment? Mr Wolfe. The microphone will come on.
Thank you, Convener. The proposal for justice centres, as I had understood it in the consultation paper, was for the concentration of non-summary business in 16 identified centres. But certainly my understanding from the original consultation was that that would leave intact a network of sheriff courts hearing summary business. And indeed, we heard one of the witnesses this morning say that at least in the interim period, other sheriffs would potentially travel out to hear cases in those summary courts. A matter the committee might wish to clarify in relation to justice centres is precisely what the proposal now is, because as I listened to the evidence this morning, I had the impression, but it may require clarification, that as far as the Borders was concerned, the suggestion was for a single justice centre with no network of summary courts. And that, it seems to me, is quite a different proposition from the one that was in the original consultation. The second point I'd like to make is a general one, which applies to court closures generally, but particularly to this proposal if it's of the sort that I've just described, which is that court closures impose costs and inconvenience on court users. And I don't need to dwell on that, given, no doubt, the evidence that you've already received from constituents. But it's important to keep in mind that it's not simply a question of the budgets of other public sector organisations, but the costs and inconvenience on individual users, witnesses, accused, and others who have to come into the court system. Which takes me to the points that were made about the use of technology. And much has been made of the potential for the use of technology to mitigate some of the adverse consequences. Now, I would be absolutely the first to embrace the appropriate use of technology in the courts, and there is considerable potential there, but there are limits. It's difficult to conceive, for example, that one could dispense with the presence of the accused in a criminal trial. There are difficulties with having key witnesses taken remotely, particularly if doc identification is required. There can be difficulties, I would imagine, in managing difficult and recalcitrant witnesses if they're remote from the courtroom. And if the witness has to be referred to documents and other productions, there can be difficulties. So that's, I think one has to put the potential for technology to fill the gap into its proper place. And if I might just make a final comment about the proposition that there should be designated centres for sheriff and jury work, I think the first point that the committee ought to keep in mind is that the court service itself recognises that that will require a capital investment programme and is a project for the long term. And they themselves have specified a number of preconditions in terms of court capacity and otherwise before the system could safely move to that model. And finally, and it's a point that we've made in a written submission, it seems to us important that for parts of rural mainland Scotland which are remote from any sheriff and jury centres, that in the long run, and not simply in the interim period, there should be flexibility in the model that's applied, the same flexibility that's being applied to island communities.
Mr. Fair, do you wish to comment on justice centres?
Our understanding was that the justice centres wouldn't be dealing with the level of summary crime that the typical justice of the peace court would be dealing with. But just echoing what Mr Wolfe has just been saying, we'd have issues over the impact to users of the service. We believe in the Scottish Justice Association there's a disproportionate negative impact on the users of courts as a result of these proposals relative to the actual business case, which we believe is less than robust and has some questionable assumptions. The cost of travel is obviously a big one. Typically, our members have to perhaps have the potential to agree the granting of warrants for apprehension of about between 20 and 25% of a typical cited court for non-attendance. Now, the reasons for non-attendance of accused might be varied. The potential in some of the centres that are subject to proposed closure might mean that such percentages might increase. And as a result of the increased potential non-attendance, then you have an additionality in cost to the wider public sector in Scotland, for instance, Police Scotland, in apprehending those and answering to answer the warrant. So there's a range of issues that that are not particularly clear in these proposals. But what does seem to be clear is that the impact on users relative to the business case itself.
Benefit of the official report, it was news to you this morning when you heard that there was going to be a feasibility study to carry out with a view to having one court in the Borders and the other studies which are taking place elsewhere in Scotland. Nodding of heads would suggest.
A whole
yes.
nodding of heads there. All four. Thank you. Just because nodding of heads doesn't come on to the OR. John, have you any other questions? You may want to develop, you said you've raised the police costs, additional police costs for having to apprehend, to bring to court. What other ones are there that you said there's a whole range that weren't in the feasibility? Maybe perhaps tell us some more.
Well, in terms of users, the cost of travel for some of the users of court. Yeah.
And then there's the police costs and having to apprehend.
In terms of the business case?
Yes,
yeah.
Other costs that you referred to.
As we understand it in the original, the financial aspects to the business case, that depreciation was put in as a saving, and that is in fact not a cashable saving, but an accounting adjustment in the books. The provision for maintenance costs seems fairly questionable also, given the fact that if the costs were so high for backlog maintenance, then for those properties that would be up for sale, the actual saleable values would be, we feel, negatively impacted by such high figures. I think £4.3 million was put in as in the original business case in terms of backlog maintenance that would be saved as a result of the proposed closures. And we feel that either if that's not a contingent liability, a liability already in the books, then if that equates to the properties that are up for sale, then it would have a negative impact. If these figures were correct on the actual capital receipt that the court service would be looking for on disposal of these properties. Obviously, with most public sector service change proposals, there is an element of optimism bias, and some of that is founded in the principal assumptions that underpin the financials. The annual cash running cost savings of 1.4 million, based on some of the assumptions we don't believe are sustainable. Typically, optimism bias in the public sector can, for this type of proposal, can be as much as 25% the wrong way. So, you know, given the potential additional costs to the local authorities in terms of criminal justice, social work, additional costs of moving from one area to another, and Police Scotland costs in terms of apprehension warrants. You know, we don't feel that the overall cost to the public purse in Scotland has been reflected in these proposals. And if you balance those against the impact on users relative to the additional travelling costs, inconvenience, and perhaps issues over travel with witnesses, etc., we think there's much more work to be done to actually justify these proposals. I mean, we do get the bit about austerity and the need for the service to save in their budgets, their overall budgets, but the proportionality of the savings compared with their overall budget relative to the negative impact on users appears to be imbalanced.
I'll move on and got Graham, Roderick and then Alison.
I want to return to this issue of the users of the court and the impact that these changes may have on them. You talked about the economic impact on them and time travelling to court. From your own experience, if you have knowledge of it, is it likely to have any impact on the willingness or otherwise of witnesses to be involved with courts, given these changes that are proposed in the future? And does it have any impact on the anxieties and stress that these witnesses might face. Has that been weighed up properly in the business case that was presented this morning in the first panel?
Mr Naismith.
Happy to reply to that. Well, firstly, I don't think it's been weighed up at all. This is a business case that's being presented to you, and I endorse what Stuart's just said. I think the arithmetic is an effrontery to common sense. But talking about impact, of course it does. Contrary to public perception, in my experience of doing both civil and criminal law and family law, appearing in court is a stressful occasion. It's something witnesses get nervous about and victims get nervous about. It's not something that people are comfortable with. If you saw it from the judiciary, I dare say Sheriff Drummond might say the same thing. Part of the being in court is to make it uncomfortable. If it was dead easy to lie, it'd be an easy experience. But so it is stressful for witnesses. And if you have cases being adjourned or long distances to travel, exposure to intimidation in all its subtle and not so subtle forms, that will have a negative effect on the willingness of citizens to come forward. And you mustn't underestimate the danger for the concepts such as justice and the rule of law. They don't just happen, they're nurtured by being supported by robust institutions in the locality that have a presence to our citizens. And I believe that any court closure will inevitably have an impact for that. So in answer to your question, I do not believe that has been assessed. I think an accountant's produced this on a batch box. And I think these are very important issues that I sincerely hope this committee takes on board. It's certainly in my view.
Sheriff Drummond.
Sadly, many of the people who are users of our courts are at the lower end of in criminal terms, are at the lower end of the earning scale. Many of them are in receipt of benefits, and we already experience people unable, and it is said quite openly, he was unable to attend because he had no money. I understand, anecdotally, that what happens is that if they don't have the money, they will turn up at the social work department office where they can be given money to enable them to travel to court. But I have direct experience of that happening, but the money found its way into the nearest licensed premises instead of the witness finding his way onto the bus to court. This happens. It will undoubtedly increase. The extent to which that will happen, I don't know.
Yes, Mr. Fair.
Yeah, we in the Justice of the Peace Court come across exactly the situation that Sheriff Drummond has outlined. Additional cost to somebody on £44 a week of job seeker allowance can be quite prohibitive if that individual is required to travel an additional journey. For instance, from the southeast corner up to Edinburgh, even from Cooper to Dundee, or the East Nook to Dundee might be a significant additional cost. And we're talking about individuals, even the accused, who are absolutely innocent up to the point of being proved in court beyond reasonable doubt to be guilty. They are impacted by the additionality of such costs. And as Sheriff Drummond quite rightly pointed out, as a proportion of the overall income, it can be significant, and we tend to find that a lot of people who do not turn up, there's a variety of reasons for that, but we think that the potential for people to not turn up because of the proposals might be a factor.
Mentioned in the previous panel that there are arrangements within the system. It was suggested that, for instance, sheriffs could make arrangements for special needs of witnesses and so forth to come to court. Has it been the experience of the panel that across courts in Scotland there is an ability for the courts to manage these things where, for instance, a witness has either particular economic difficulties or is under stress and anxiety due to some form of intimidation? Are the courts good at dealing with that kind of circumstance currently?
Sheriff Drummond, yes.
Witnesses or Crown witnesses, or both. Crown witnesses, I would imagine, I know that the Crown would know if they have a formally identified vulnerable witness, because they will have made a vulnerable witness application to the court beforehand, and I would have expected that the fiscal will have made some kind of arrangement as to whether or not that witness requires special travel arrangements. It doesn't always happen, and there are degrees of vulnerability. And it is simply another one of the additional costs which has to be faced up to. But to come back to an earlier part of the same question, the police are also court users, and it is possible to carry out an exercise in which at least the indicative costs of additional police cost will be able to be identified. And within my written submission, it is at Appendix C of my memorandum of October 2012. I have copies here if it would save time. You will find a letter from Lothian and Borders Police to me, and this was nothing to do with court closures. I was concerned that there were too many police officers giving evidence, and I was wondering whether or not the local bar were doing their job as well as they should be. So I carried out a private exercise in which I asked the divisional commander to provide me with the details of the numbers of police officers who had actually given evidence. So here we have, in 2008, not in any context of closures or anything else, a cold, objective assessment. And in 2 months, in September and October 2008, 144 police witnesses were cited from that division. Now, it should also be appreciated that the process of citation of witnesses is itself a time-consuming and cost-relevant factor for the Procurator Fiscal. Of those 144 who were cited, 32 actually gave evidence. And you will find that on the second page of that document,
Somebody, if you turn to the back
I have
of your
copies of
no,
it
we
here
have
if
it.
it would save time.
We have it. It's in our papers. It's the penultimate page in your brown folder with the schedule on page 14 in the appendix. We have it. We have it.
If you look at the second page of that, you will find the divisional commander saying to me, it should also be noted that there are considerable financial implications in the division in terms of backfill costs for those officers required to attend court, and this can vary depending on the notice. In relation to the 2-month period under review, the following costs, now those are not the backfill costs. The backfill costs could be quantified. Those quite simply arise from the fact that you can't have a police officer, for example, on night shift, and then being required to turn up for court at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then being expected to go back on duty again. There requires to be a restructuring, and these restructuring arrangements give rise to additional costs. But you will see that the total cost for that division for that part of the financial year, which was about 6 months, for that part of the division was £16,000 in round terms. Now that figure, whilst it might be dangerous, but that figure can be extrapolated into the number of divisions, the cost for that force, multiplied by the number of forces. Now that's probably dangerous, because the situation may be very different in the city of Edinburgh than it is in the Borders. But that activity, that work, that costing is capable of being carried out. And I would have hoped that that kind of exercise would have been carried out, because I asked at the first workshop when these proposals were being first mentioned, that the civil servant, the senior civil servant from St Andrews House in the police division could be able to provide a percentage figure. Is it 1%? Is it 0.1%? Is it 0.001%? But either of these, any of these figures produces a substantial figure, and the extrapolation which I suggested brings a figure of £1.5 million. The costing is able to be done. It appears not to have been done.
Thank you. I mean, because that's another cost that that's unforeseen or that has certainly not been specified to us. Roderick?
Morning, panel. Could I just kind of follow on from what Sheriff Drummond was saying to say that there is a reference to police witnesses in the SES response of April 2013. We didn't actually ask them in evidence about these proposals, paragraph 1.20. I think, convener, it might be helpful if we actually put those Sheriff Drummond's points to the Chief Executive of the Scottish Court Service, and they can expand on paragraph 1.20.
Yes, well, I anticipate they'll respond to many of the points that have been raised in the subsequent evidence that we have following their evidence session. And if they haven't, it's now on the record that we want them to.
I think I should also refer to my register of interest as a member of the Faculty of Advocates. I was interested in your initial response to the consultation, the Faculty of Advocates consultation, to the reference to Sheriff Taylor's consultation on expenses, which obviously is not yet reported, and to the extent to which that might have an impact on civil litigation. Perhaps the panel would comment on kind of civil litigation in Scotland generally and where it might be going. Perhaps Mr. Wolfe could start that one off.
Well, as the committee is aware, these proposals are brought forward at a time when the government is consulting on a radical restructuring of the civil court system. And it's perhaps not appropriate for me to start responding to a consultation which is not before this committee in the present context. But it is part of the context in which these proposals have been brought forward. It does seem to me that there is a serious job of work to be done in relation to civil justice in the sheriff courts. And we would certainly support and welcome proposals to improve the conduct of business in the sheriff court. Anecdotal evidence speaks on the civil side of cases in the sheriff court being distributed over a number of diets, which is simply an inefficient way to do business. So that's part of the background context. You mentioned Sheriff Taylor's report on expenses, and the particular issue that caught my eye and which was referred to in the faculty's original response is that the incidence of civil litigation in Scotland is very low compared with other jurisdictions. And that raises questions about the level of unmet legal need in Scotland, and does raise questions about whether the decline in court business to which you were referred earlier reflects a long-term trend or even a desirable trend. I should say in terms of that particular point, there has been a significant decline in court business over the last few years. To what extent that's a function of the economic circumstances, one doesn't know. And it is that this committee is looking at these proposals also in a context where it is extraordinarily difficult to predict future court business because of other things that are happening in the justice system. The proposal to abolish corroboration, for example, and I don't want to get drawn into that but it does invite a question about the impact that that proposal will have on the level of criminal business. And as this committee is well aware, because we have a unified criminal and civil court structure in Scotland, changes in criminal business have a knock-on impact for civil business. So I'm not sure I've necessarily answered Mr. Campbell's question, but I suppose the point that this committee will want to keep in mind is that there are a number of much broader issues in relation to the future of the civil justice system in the context of the justice system as a whole, which are part of the background and context for this particular proposal. And no doubt the committee will want to be concerned that things are not done now which prejudge or prejudice the way things may go in the future.
Sheriff Drummond.
Convener, perhaps we should get something clear in answer to Mr. Campbell's question about the context. It's certainly no intention on my part to try to preserve the status quo. The status quo is gone. We must change and we must adapt and we must make best use of the resources which we have. Now, the Gill Review, in conjunction with the Court Reform Bill, which is implementing parts of the Gill Review, what essentially it was doing was seeking to strike a balance between centralisation, specialisation, and access to justice. And the context in which most of this discussion is taking place is on the last of those three, namely access to justice. No one is suggesting we require to have appropriate specialisation. We require to have appropriate centralisation. How do we balance those with the third factor, which is access to justice? And these Scottish Court Service proposals are part of that process. And that is the context in which we should be looking at them, and that is the context in which I approach it, namely, how do we balance this in the context of a rural justice policy? So far as I can see, there isn't one. There is no body of principles against which we can measure, or no formula no policy formula against which we can measure these for the provision of rural justice. This is proceeding on the basis of an accounting exercise alone. Two standards: proximity and volume. Proximity to another court and volume of business. Those are perfectly appropriate standards to apply in an accounting exercise, but they are not the whole picture. They are nothing like the whole picture. And that is perhaps being lost sight of in the approach which is being taken. The Scottish Court Service, I don't blame them at all for the approach which they have taken. They require to work within their budget. We all require to work within our budgets. But I am respectfully suggesting that their proposals are capable of refinement and improvement. That is not the same as defending the status quo. We're saying we can do this better. And one of the ways in which I've already suggested we can do it better is, instead of people in the rural context travelling to the court travels to the people, to put it crudely and bluntly. I don't know if that contributes, Mr. Campbell, to an answer to your question.
Mean that if I just press a little further, Sheriff Drummond, that there would, if the government were going down the route of a justice centre, but there would be options for the sheriff to still go out in cases that required it to local areas, given the difficulties of transport, without actually having a sheriff court building as such.
That would be the absolute ideal, so far as I'm concerned. If we were able to have a centre in which a specialist or specialist sheriffs could sit, and in which you don't require the volume of business in, for example, the borders courts on specialist areas is not such as to justify the permanent presence of a specialist sheriff. I run a commercial court, I run a family court, I run a drug treatment and testing order court, I run all of these things. There is no scope for, in the borders, a specialist sheriff on each of these. But if we had a centre where a specialist sheriff could attend, if necessary, but we still had the facility to go out and do the routine business in other locations. But the problem is we're closing the other locations. And Peebles council chambers will still remain there. And we have a dock which is on wheels in which we trundle out on 2 days a month, and the court comes along and does the business. And the court is sufficiently flexible to be able to say, we'll continue this to Selkirk next Thursday, we'll continue this to somewhere else. We have that flexibility because we have that location at no cost. The same could be achieved for Duns. The same could be achieved perhaps in other rural areas. I can't say what is the situation in other rural areas, and I wouldn't attempt to do so, but it would seem to me to be highly unlikely that it could be achieved in the borders and couldn't be achieved somewhere else. And accordingly, what is the model that we should be looking at? And we're not approaching it from that standpoint. The Scottish Court Service proposals begin at an early stage by Mr McQueen saying, and this is referred to in my first memorandum of April 2012, in a letter of 30th March 2012, page 4, addressing future court structures, Mr McQueen says, page 3, paragraph 1, quote, "We would see more judicial travelling as inefficient." That is the approach which has been taken. And in my respectful submission, that is a flawed approach, which has coloured the approach. And as someone who has spent his entire judicial career travelling round the rural countryside, I can say that without fear of contradiction. I would rather, I don't care it's the back of a large furniture van that you're going to conduct the court in, the court should go to the rural locations. And I have looked at the situation in other jurisdictions, which I don't think we ever have. For example, I spend a not insignificant part of my spare time in Montana fishing. Montana is 2 or 3 times the size of the United Kingdom and has a population of 1 or 2 million. It is a huge rural area, but it provides highly efficient rural justice services. I've gone and discussed with them, how do you do it? What's the best way to do it? They have a different structure, there's no point in exploring it here, but we seem to think that there is only one way to do it, and that's close them. There's not. There are much more imaginative ways to approach rural justice, but it would help everybody if there was a formulation of some policy against which we could measure it, and we don't have one. We don't have.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr Wolfe, you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, I wonder if I might just endorse what Sheriff Drummond said about the the arrangements have to change, and that I, for my part, am not here defending the status quo, and like Mr Naismith, the notion of justice centres and specialism of sheriffs, which is perhaps a key point, has a great deal to commend it, but it requires for rural Scotland, rural mainland Scotland, to be looked at with flexibility and perhaps in a different way. It's recognised that the island communities have special needs so far as these issues are concerned, and it does respectfully seem to me that Sheriff Drummond's suggestion that when appropriate, sheriffs can travel rather than people travelling in areas of rural mainland Scotland is a model that ought to be considered. And I was heartened at first to hear one of the witnesses this morning say that that's a model that they have in mind. During the interim period, the 10-year programme that was described to you, but I was disappointed not to hear him say that that model would continue to be applied thereafter. I think the proposition is this, and I say this as someone born and bred in southwest Scotland, that for rural mainland Scotland, the issues of access and accessibility ought to lead one to look creatively at a more flexible approach.
Which would mean, I take it, that one wouldn't necessarily have to retain the actual court building. You talked about the back of a furniture van. I'm not expecting everything to be done in the back of a furniture van like that, but it could be an ad hoc situation, but still allow, in circumstances, as described by John Lamont, you know, like Eyemouth, or I don't want to focus on the borders all the time, but it would allow that flexibility, something we should be looking at. Sheriff Drummond, I'm going to take Mr Naismith. Sheriff Drummond, no.
That might require some statutory modification, because, I mean, you can't just hold the court anywhere that you have to feel like it. And it may be that that is one of the considerations which should be taken into account in connection with the Court Reform Bill, that there should be power to a Sheriff Principal to designate specific locations as a courtroom for ad hoc purposes.
Can't do that just now.
Can't do that.
I didn't know that.
No, I think it requires special order from, it may be that Mr Campbell might be better informed on this than I.
He's not here to give evidence, actually. I'm saving you. But I had thought, I seem to remember a court going into the middle of a field to check whether a tup was worth the price that had been paid.
Taking evidence, that's not a problem.
Different. Right,
you can go anywhere to take evidence,
okay.
but the business requires to be conducted from a designated place.
Okay, thank you, I understand now. I'm not suggesting that we make fields one of the designated places. Mr. Naismith.
Yes, thank you. As a practicing solicitor, I would be at pains to emphasise that opposition to court closures is not to be seen as opposition to modernisation, reform or increase in efficiencies, or in particular to be seen as defence of maintaining the court structure. Mr Campbell was mentioning the impact on civil business. Civil business embraces family law as well as contract reparation, the other types of civil business handled in the courts. I mentioned this on a previous visit to your committee that from my perspective, I actually see no association between family law, criminal law and the rest of civil law. Family law should be seen as a particular speciality. Whether it's reflective of the Scottish Courts position or not, but informally in discussion between the Law Society and the Scottish Courts Administration in relation to the sheriffs travelling, whether this is the official position or not, it seemed to be regarded as inconceivable that the sheriff would leave his court. And I endorse what Sheriff Drummond just said. I think that should be part of the flexibility that he talks about that should be applied in relation to rural courts. Because Hamilton Sheriff Court, for example, is a family law court that seems to me to be a suite of offices. It's entirely appropriate. It's perfectly suitable for the business it deals with. It's a completely different requirement if you have a prisoner in custody for a summary or a solemn criminal business. So that has to be taken into the equation. You mentioned the cost of closing courts and travelling in relation to civil business. I believe that civil business represents approximately 20% of the cases registered or the business registered with our sheriff courts, and of that 20%, approximately 90%, I believe, is undefended. So a lot of civil business could be open to cost savings by administrative efficiencies. But we still have to have a system where the other 10%, there must be a system for dispute resolution in a sophisticated society. And there is, unfortunately, cost is a factor. Travelling costs, be it for solicitors or for witnesses, would impact more on the cost. Mr Wolfe referred to maybe there's a need not being met, civil cases are dropping. Expense is a very significant factor. And bear in mind, if you are having witnesses travelling to centres where rural courts close, two things will happen. Either one, the solicitors will be travelling too, which makes even more increase in costs, but much more likely the solicitors just won't be around in the locality to provide the advice, and an access to justice resource is lost. So there will be an impact, and it's something which should be taken into account. But our overriding view, the one endorsed by several contributions today, is that in short, the Scottish Court Service may make some savings, but we believe these will simply be passed on to other agencies. And the suggestion earlier today that there might be indeed a saving to, for example, the Scottish Legal Aid Board, which you're going to make inquiries into, I consider that to be utterly inconceivable.
Before I take Sheriff John, I don't know if you want back in, Mr Fair. Were you wanting any? I didn't know if you wanted any, you didn't.
And Convener, it was just in the context of what was said about family law being part of it, a concrete example of travel and specialisation arrangements. The Procurator Fiscal at Selkirk wanted to arrange for a single domestic abuse court for the borders to be conducted in Selkirk. I said that was not going to happen. I did not let it happen, and let me tell you why. Because a victim of domestic abuse living in Eyemouth will find it is being subjected to more abuse by the system and having to travel all the way across the borders to get to Selkirk. in order to have that case dealt with, and maybe even more reluctant to speak up than they would previously. So I said that is not going to happen. But there will be a domestic abuse court in Selkirk, and there will be another one in Jedburgh. And you will have the other one in Jedburgh in order to be able to accommodate people from the eastern part of the borders. You're not going to be dragging them around. Now, I was in a position to exercise sufficient authority or influence to prevent that taking place. But that is effectively what may be being sought to be done. To have people who are already in distress or in difficulty, travelling even further distances, to have their grievances addressed, and it may be that there will be some reluctance on their part. The only thing, lest there be thought to be any special pleading, none of this in any shape or form will affect me at all, because I reach my judicial sell-by date at the end of October, and accordingly there is no special pleading of any kind here, and I'm simply trying to be as objective and as helpful to the committee as I can.
And like the Governor of the Bank of England, you are released in that way to speak. I'm not saying you wouldn't have done otherwise. Alison, followed by Sandra, and then Lewis.
Thank you. I think it's been really worthwhile to explore the impact on rural communities, because I think it's absolutely demonstrated that rural communities are being asked to settle for second best. But I would like to turn to court capacity, really, under the proposals, and particularly those courts that are affected by the proximity argument rather than the volume argument for closure. In my own area, Stonehaven and Arbroath. Now, we heard from the earlier panel of witnesses that if you combine Stonehaven and Aberdeen, you will be close to the tolerable limits. And yet they were very confident that efficiencies in the conjoined business would mean that all the business could be accommodated. I would be interested in hearing the panel's views on whether or not that's a realistic assessment.
Mr. Fair.
Yes, our members, justices in Stonehaven and Arbroath, have indicated their disquiet about the potential for efficiencies to be engineered. It would be their view at the moment that in terms of performance, that it is the case that the service is struggling to just get by, and the ability to re-engineer the service and import further efficiencies seems a bit remote at the coalface at present.
No one else wishes to comment on that particular one? No. So have you anything else, Alison, you want to ask?
No, perhaps pursue a little bit about the civil court reform. Mr Wolfe said that he didn't want to stray into another consultation, but again we heard the previous panel say that they were confident that there would be minimal impact from whatever came through. Do you have a response to that confidence?
Well, certainly I wouldn't be at all confident, and our feature of the civil court reform will be the compulsory transfer of a very significant volume of cases from the Court of Session into the Sheriff Court. Now, and one has to ask the question what the impact will be on, first of all, business in the Sheriff Court, but also one has to ask the question about the impact on those litigants who currently choose to litigate in the Court of Session. They have chosen to take their cases there in a context where they could litigate in the Sheriff Court, and no doubt there are a variety of reasons for that. But the proposition in the context of the Civil Court's review seems to be that we will transfer this very significant volume of cases into a Sheriff Court system in a context where the long-term vision for improving the Sheriff Court civil justice is something that's going to take place only over a period of, we're told, 10 years, but which is going to be dependent on significant capital investment in the Sheriff Courts. And while I don't want to preempt what might be said about the Civil Court review consultation, one must at least ask the question whether it's putting the cart before the horse to move cases in volume from the Court of Session to the Sheriff Court system until you've sorted out the Sheriff Courts. If I might just perhaps say a brief word on Ms McInnes' previous question. We've not expressed any view on the closure of specific courts, because I think all of us would recognise that the court service has to manage its estate, and that from time to time the issue of closing particular court buildings will arise. What we felt able to do is to draw attention to a number of impacts on court users which ought to be properly taken into account when these decisions are made. And it is right, I would suggest, to look at the question of capacity of the courts that are receiving business in a context where the future level of business is uncertain, and in a context where in the criminal field there are statutory time bars that require to be met. It's fair to say anecdotal evidence doesn't suggest that busier courts are necessarily get through the business more quickly. And it's absolutely right to look at questions of capacity and resilience for the long term.
I understand entirely that you don't want to take a position on individual courts, so without pressing you on that, just would be interested in your view on the wisdom of relying on these so-called efficiencies that are suddenly going to come into the system when things are operating near to capacity at the moment. Do you believe that there are so many inefficiencies in the way the courts are operated at the moment that miraculously in the next year we can find all these efficiencies?
I don't think you're going to adopt the word miraculously for a start.
I suspect not miraculous. No. If I put it this way, and I should say that the evidence I can give on this is reflecting inevitably, as it were, anecdotal experience of my members reported to me. But the anecdotal experience in the civil side is that civil proofs are distributed over a number of hearings rather than being heard at one go, which builds in serious inefficiency into the actual running of the case. And the impression that one gets is that there is a job of work to be done, and it won't happen miraculously. It will take hard work. It may take procedural reforms. It will take a whole raft of measures to make civil justice in the Sheriff Courts work better than it currently does.
I want to... Oh, sorry, Mr Naismith.
I could just respond to that. I am a court practitioner, lawyer, solicitor. My local court is Paisley. It's not really identified by court closures. It's identified as being a busy court. It's destined to be a centre of excellence and to hold sheriff and jury business. But if you think of the geography of it, I've appeared in lots of sheriff courts in central Scotland that are geographically not too far from where I earn my living. And I've not been left with the impression that sheriff courts are hugely underutilised. I go to courts and find them busy. I'm sure any organisation could have efficiencies. I did a rough calculation. I noticed that if Arbroath closed and the business moved to Forfar, roughly 1,300 cases of the various civil, solemn, solemn summary are affected. So I would have thought 1,300 cases transferring to Forfar Sheriff Court, irrespective of how it's received, would have some impact. But the point I think I would like to make is I'm quite sure the statistics and that you've already heard today about the length of time between a case calling and proceeding to trial, and the number of cases lost due to non-attendance of witness or things like that. These are important statistics, and discussions about free court time in the recipient court that could be utilised by the transferring court to do judicial business. But I would say that it's not an exact match. I think you have to consider what is actually happening here. Procedural courts are all cited at 10 o'clock. People turn up. Most people are on time. Some people aren't. There is inherent inefficiency in the system. How do you deal with that? Well, not requiring personal attendance might be some of it. But the preponderance of attendances at courts start in the morning. The mornings are busy. Cases that are scheduled to proceed don't proceed for various reasons. Evidence comes out, witness don't turn up, people get ill, things happen. The court doesn't work like a production line. It will not produce 15,000 widgets an hour every hour. It's the nature of the beast. And I'm quite sure everyone in this room has a feeling for what I'm talking about. So when it is suggested that there is X hours that can now be utilised, that Aberdeen should be operating at 97%, the reality is that this cannot conceivably be achieved. We are a multi-purpose society, and, you know, excuse the French, shit happens in everyone's day, if you pardon the phrase. And sometimes it's nobody's fault. And so, therefore,
inverted commas.
I would say that you know, there must be an impact.
Expression, yes.
In my view.
Not in my court, madam.
What, it doesn't happen, or the expression doesn't happen? Anyway, sorry, it's been a long day. On you.
I don't think you can fill it to capacity.
Right, I've been warned, it's just 12 o'clock, but it seems like a long day. Sandra White, followed by Lewis MacDonald, and then Jenny Mara, please.
Thank you, Convener. It is afternoon now, so good afternoon in that respect. I think everyone agrees, and you've already said already, that it's part of, you know, a parcel of changes, reforms, etc. And I thought I'd better give perhaps Sheriff Drummond a chance to answer the question I'd put to the previous panel in regards to, you know, some courts being underutilised. And I did give the reference to sheriffs who turn up, they're there for a couple of days and there's no cases, which I've been told is wrong. But I wanted clarification on that, because, you know, what you've said yourself, Sheriff Drummond, is that basically it's not the building, it's the access to justice. So I take your point on board, but the other witnesses seem to say that yes, it is access to justice, but you cannot close down these courts in these areas. So I just wanted a wee bit more clarification from yourself, Sheriff Drummond. If these courts are opened, as I asked the previous panel, some people will sit for it'll be open for 2 days, basically sitting for 2 days, but open for 5.
I think you're approaching this, perhaps, on a basis of one size fits all. That's not the case. Let us take, for example, Peebles, and I take it as an extreme and good example of extreme within the system. Peebles Sheriff Court is, in fact, the council chambers. And the court sits for 2 days a month. 1 day doing crime, 1 day doing civil. There is a dock on wheels. It gets trundled out, and the council chambers becomes a courtroom. There is no question of anybody sitting there for any number of days waiting to see if some business wanders in the door. That doesn't happen. The business is scheduled, is programmed in advance. The clerks know what is happening. If business is seen going down, other business is sought to be put in. I should be, in fact, presiding over a jury in Selkirk just now. But by reason of being here, I am now going to go and do Duns on Wednesday, and Jedburgh's business for Thursday and Friday, which were civil proofs, will be down. It would be very nice to sit and twiddle my thumbs for a couple of days, but the clerk has telephoned Edinburgh to say, could you use Sheriff Drummond? You bet they could. So I will then come into Edinburgh, and I will be sitting in Edinburgh for 2 days. So there is a lot actually goes on within the system, and you don't have, it's not the kind of open at 9 o'clock in the morning and stand out in the steps hoping somebody comes in to buy some justice. It's not like that. There is scheduling and programming of things going on. Now, just, if I might say finally in this context, we have been, in the course of these discussions, concentrating on 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, I couldn't tell you what specific courts. It hasn't yet been mentioned, but from conversations with colleagues, I am given to understand generally that there are some of these courts which it is accepted the case for closure is irresistible. That is purely anecdotal. I would not dare to venture into someone else's jurisdiction and say this court is not suitable for remaining open. But I just hear anecdotally there are one or two of these courts which are irresistibly due for change. By the same token, there are one or two or three or four or more within it in which the situation is still significantly contentious for the kind of issues that have been explored here. If it is possible, and I don't know if it is, that a deferral of the closure decision should be able to be taken in relation to those courts where it is contentious in order to allow, I don't know, and this is moving into areas which are beyond my pay grade and are beyond my activity, but to enable the background costs, the contingent costs, the hidden costs that we've been talking about to be examined, to find out whether all of the alternatives or any alternatives have been explored or exist, and to enable the formulation of some measure against which the policy position which I've suggested, so that we have some measure for this, not just for now, but for the future. I've spent most of my time in the Borders dealing with proposals to close Peebles and Duns. They're still open, and I'm getting a bit fed up with them, to be quite honest.
Could I...
So I wanted also have spent my time stopping the closure of Peebles and Duns in my time. You mentioned something there about seeking a deferral in certain cases. I don't know whether that's technically possible with what's coming before us, but we'll certainly explore what's technically feasible, whether it's a take-it-all under the SSI or not, as the case may be, whether there's any prospects of doing something else. So certainly we'll explore that.
My reason for saying so is that if the closures are simply announced, and there is a risk that some of the work which may need to be done on these will simply not be done. Whereas if there is a deferral, at least the opportunity for rethinking is concerned. And I haven't addressed Peebles in detail. I would like to, but...
Yep. And of course, there are different dates in the SSI for the proposed thing. But I think the technicalities of what one can do with an SSI that I call an omnibus with all the courts in it, we'd have to really explore with the Cabinet Secretary and his officers. Sandra, sorry.
Yes, I wanted to throw it open to the other three witnesses, because obviously Sheriff Drummond spoke about one specific area, and a very good example he gave two, but also was very objective about there may be other courts that should close because of the lack of business. I just wanted to see what the other three witnesses had to say. If they had any comments on that.
If you have anything. Yes, Mr. Fair.
Yeah. We don't have, in the Scottish Justice Association, we wouldn't put forward the case that that all the courts should be defended in their status quo in perpetuity. The volumes of business has undoubtedly impacted the summary criminal side. The fiscal fine, or the increase in the fiscal fine, the application of the fiscal fine has seen a significant volume of business from the Justice of Peace Court disappear. In fact, within 2 years, the volume of fiscal fines have moved up from about 34,500 to about 46,000, so it's increased by about a third. And that's had quite a significant impact on the working of the GP court, when in fact the application of these fines decriminalise crime, and the fact they're not dealt with as crimes. So our business has dropped significantly, and we understand that the SCS quite properly are looking at the volumes. But what we consider to be the right way forward is to expand the business case to a full cost benefit analysis, where you would actually weight the non-financial issues and compare the non-financial position alongside the financial benefits of these proposals. If you were looking at the overall cost of the service 1 year to the next in the resource accounts, aside from inflation and pay award inflation, you probably not perceived to be much in the way of change. The The Chief Executive of the SCS this morning has indicated there will be no job losses as a result of these proposals, but obviously there are going to be additional costs of moving people about, redeployment, etc. But when you're looking at the costs that have been put up in the business case for efficiency savings, if you look at 1 year to another, it'd be very, very difficult to see where these efficiency savings come in and convert themselves into cashable savings. Perhaps the business might be dealt with more efficiently, and if efficiently means quicker and better justice, then that is a victory. But if the whole proposition is founded on a pure financial cost-saving exercise in budgets, then it's kind of one-dimensional in effect. So
that message about there's lots of hidden costs across the spectrum, which we will pick up on. I'm trying to move on because it's been a long morning. We've got another panel of witnesses. Anybody else wishing to? Right, I've got Lewis followed by Jenny.
Very much. The witnesses we heard earlier, and I'll refer here specifically to Aberdeen and Stonehaven, but there is a general question behind the point. The witnesses we heard earlier confirmed that Aberdeen is taking an average of 23 weeks to deal with a case, or for a case to come to trial, where it should, according to the Court Service's own target, be 16 weeks. And we've also heard from the Court Service their assertion and some evidence that the capacity of the 2 courtrooms at Stonehaven is greater, unused capacity is greater than it is at Aberdeen. I think that's self-evident. One proposal that's come forward from the community has been that Stonehaven Sheriff Court, rather than closing, should become a sub-court of Aberdeen Sheriff Court and the same would apply, I think, to the JP side, that rather than close buildings which provide a useful function already and are part of the system already, that they could be accommodated, they could accommodate some of the unmet need in the main courts. Given what's been said, I think by a number of the witnesses about a more flexible approach, does that strike witnesses as offering the kind of flexible approach to delivering justice that would benefit both rural and indeed the urban court users? And could I ask particularly the 3 organisations representatives here whether there was any discussion with their organisations by the Court Service about more flexible approaches before the initial consultation proposing a closure strategy was brought forward?
Mr. Naismith.
On your last point, I can't tell you whether there was any discussion with the Law Society on the flexible approach. I've certainly not heard about it, so I rather suspect not, but colleagues within the Law Society will be happy to clarify that for this committee. As to Stonehaven being an outsource from Aberdeen, I think I envisage what you mean by that is it might sit, it might be 1 day a week, it might be 1 day a month, it would not have a full court infrastructure within the building. I think that is inevitably the way forward for access to justice and the justice system in the future. I'm also of the view that we don't need to be hamstrung by a need to preserve some of our older Sheriff Court buildings. I'm sure I'm correct if I'm wrong, but I know the sheriffdoms were designated at least in the 1800s at some point, so we have a court plonked in a prominent town in the various sheriffdoms, and that's the history of it, and you start with the building that's there. But in the modern justice system, there is no requirement for that. The buildings can be more custom built. Sheriff Drummond referred to using the council chamber. This is exactly the kind of versatility that produces cost savings without access to justice consequences. So when you talk about outsourcing a court, and Ms. White there was mentioning earlier whether we were wanting to preserve some of the courts, I think our point really is that basically from the law science perspective, access to justice means courts should be public, they should be local, they should be efficient, they should be accessible, and using a sort of outsource would be a way of dealing with that. And also, by way of, if you're talking preserving a court building, we're not saying it should be fully manned by all the staff, the infrastructure, the full-time employees that make up our smaller courts. We see no reason why it couldn't be used in the way you're suggesting. It could be populated, once a week or something.
appreciate that there are maintenance elements for old buildings that are underutilised, but planning forward, there can be more use made of other public buildings, and that seems to me an obvious cost saving and the potential, not in this financial year, perhaps not in your term in government, but in the future. It strikes me as joined up thinking for a way of promoting the kind of savings and cost savings which are required without damaging the access to justice principles, which we are very keen to have preserved.
None of us around this committee are actually in government. We're all backbenchers or opposition. So just to make that distinction, sometimes my own party wonders what party I'm in. Mr. Fair.
The Scottish Justice Association has regular liaison meetings with the Scottish Court Service, and they're very positive. We have a good line of communication with the Chief Executive and his senior staff. However, we're unaware of proposals to flex the system in the way that you suggest. Certainly, what gives us a concern is the principles, access to justice principles that were issued in 2010 and promulgated by the Lord President, Lord Justice Clark. We believe that two of them, in terms of access to justice, are really conflict with these proposals. The Justice of the Peace is ideally suited to deal with local matters. The Justice of the Peace has a 400-year unbroken history in Scotland, and the lay justice is a fairly unique feature in the way that it's applied in Scotland. The ability to have a single sitting lay judge with the power of verdict and sentence, as far as we are aware, is pretty unique in Europe, and the ability to be in touch with the local community cannot be overstated. The local courts have a focus for local cohesion, we believe, and do play a part in the life of civic life in communities. The issue about flexibility we would welcome. We have already in the past dealt with court forums in a flexible nature. One of the courts that I think is in these proposals, Cumbernauld Justice of Peace Court, is actually held in North Lanarkshire Council offices with the same arrangements as Sheriff Drummond has outlined in the Borders. It used to be the court chamber for Cumbernauld and Kilsyth District Council, and it was utilised fairly well. So I believe the state, there could be more flexibility used in the court estate at minimal cost that could perhaps deal with some of these issues very effectively.
I'm going to move on to Jenny Mather.
Thanks, Convener. The panel may have heard me ask the first witnesses about the EU directive and the impact of these court closure proposals on victims and witnesses. Can I have any views from the panel on whether these proposals are compliant with the directive?
Faintest idea.
I think it go only marginally further. I too have not the faintest idea. I'm pretty sure someone in the Law Society will have an idea, and I would be happily ask my society to write to your committee on that particular point.
Yes, Mr. Wolfe, you've not the faintest.
I'm afraid I don't have a view on that either, but...
That's a better way of saying it. You're not either. Although the faintest idea is what we understand. Yes, I think we've got the questions, so if perhaps we have clarification from the Law Society, it would be very helpful. Mr. Fair, do you?
Oh, no, I have no idea. Presumably if they weren't compliant and the Scottish Parliament decided to approve these, that they could potentially be judicially reviewable under natural justice provisions. But I have no idea in terms of compliance.
My reason for asking the question now is not to get to that point. We do have a bill on victims and witnesses going through the Parliament at the moment. Thank you.
Now, unless we've missed something, I don't feel you have to say anything. Is there anything we haven't asked you're itching to tell us? Excellent, excellent. Right, thank you very much for your evidence. I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes, little break. I'm not going to move on to title conditions report. We'll defer that to another day because you've had a lot this morning. So 5 minutes. Thank you very much. I now we reconvene, and it's our third panel, and you've had a long, long wait, so thank you very much. I've got Brian Carroll, PCS, Scottish Court Service Branch, Public and Commercial Services Union, Lauren Wood, Social Policy Officer, CAB, Citizens Advice Scotland, I should say, Alan McCloskey, Assistant Deputy Chief Executive Business Delivery Victim Support Scotland, and Councillor Margaret Kennedy, Chair, Fife and Forth Valley Community Justice Authority. And I move straight to questions. Committee. Graham?
Yeah. I'll offer a general question to all four, maybe get started into the final part. You've listened to the previous two panels, and you've heard the proposals and you've heard the implications. Where do the proposals and the implications leave each of your separate interests for the future? And do you feel that your views have been shared with the executive and have been listened to?
Mr. Carroll.
From our point of view, certainly in respect of our members who will be affected by the proposals, we have entered into various agreements with Scottish Court Service in terms of mitigating the impact of those closures on our members. And we're hoping that our members are quite happy with the package that is in place. Having said that, one of the unintended consequences of what is going to happen is that the package that is in place is time limited. And we recognise that it was never going to be in place forever. But the fact is that it will be time limited, and we have members already who are expressing concern and anxiety once that time limited package ceases as to how they might be able to afford to continue working for Scottish Court Service.
I think in the discussions, Citizens Advice Scotland are only making statements in terms of civil justice, which focuses in the considerations that we have, or that I have had during the course of the debate. One of my major concerns about the proposals for court closures, which also relates to the proposals for court reform, is a loss in the whole system approach that the Making Justice Work programme is working towards in terms of civil justice. And that's a vision of a justice system which sees information and advice and alternative dispute resolution, as well as formal dispute resolution means, as part of one integral system. I met with the Scottish Court Service recently and asked the question, in the proposals for the closures, has there been any consideration in the courts where the business is to condense to about a room where mediation could take place, or an arbitration court and space for that? And the answer was no. And that makes me very worried about how these reforms and how the closures are taking account of the whole system approach. And I know the discussion here is about courts, but I think in divorcing the courts from that whole system approach is a very, very negative thing for consumers of the civil justice system as time goes on.
Before we move on along the panel, an interesting point you raised about ADR mediation. If you heard the stuff about justice centres, would it not be easier? I mean, some of the old courts won't have any rooms for that to take place. Would that be a plus, say, in favour, tick a plus side in the box for a justice centre to have mediation or ADR rooms set aside as part of it, rather than try to squeeze that into facilities that don't exist?
I think it definitely would be, and I think in my vision of what a justice centre would be, it would undoubtedly include mediation and arbitration and alternative dispute resolution. I think I would go a step further than that even, to say that there should be some way of gatekeeping cases, so that it's not that cases are resolved at the court doors, but that cases are resolved far before it ever comes to the point they should be at the court doors. And I think that could happen in situations around the country which don't have to be attached to a court building. And I think the most important part to get right about court reform and court closures in terms of civil justice, and in cases like small small claims and even housing disputes is making sure that people are on the right pathway to the justice that they see for their dispute. So if that involves a day in court, then that may be the right path. But the consumer focus research that came out in December quite clearly shows that even when people have a legal problem, the resolution that they seek is not necessarily through judicial means. And actually, in early advice, early negotiation, alternative dispute resolution, people can be put on a path to justice that much better suits the justice that they seek to their resolution.
Thank you. Mr. McCloskey.
Thank you. We have a number of concerns about the court reform proposals. In particular, it seems a very narrow approach, and it doesn't take account, in our view, of the wider justice strategy for Scotland, which talks about making justice work, priorities for victims and witnesses, accessibility, making justice accessible. And it seems as if they're just looking at, which we acknowledge, a purely financial aspect in terms of court closure. And that's a very narrow approach. It doesn't take the wider aspect of justice, how people actually get to court buildings, and the impact on victims and witnesses, the impact on our resources. I mean, we've already got staff and volunteers in a number of the courts that are earmarked for closure that will be directly affected by the proposals, and they may or may not stay with us if those courts close. So we have a number of concerns around that. And as evidence was provided earlier, I think we do need to consider a more flexible approach and be innovative about how justice can be served, rather than just taking a blanket, let's close a court because it's old, or there's not many people that go there and it's only there once or twice a month. That seems a very narrow approach.
Mr. Kennedy.
Good afternoon. The two main factors, I think, from looking at it from a councillor's perspective, both as a local councillor and as a convener of the CGIA, the SCS were at pains really to say that their proposals have not been made in isolation from the wider justice system. But from my perspective, linking to the previous two speakers, that I would challenge that in the sense that the potential knock-on effects to other individuals, which we've heard about already, whether that be victims or witnesses or indeed agencies, thinking around mental health welfare issues perhaps, brings in the NHS, so it's not just about local authorities. I don't feel that they have made their decisions in respect of the wider justice system, which does take into account what was touched on previously around the co-terminosity, co-location, I beg your pardon, in relation to certain agencies. I would use the example, parochially perhaps, but in relation to Cooper, which has been raised previously, that we already have the police, criminal justice, social work and other agencies. We actually have citizens and vice in the same building as well. So from the point of view of being able to signpost people who have quite complex issues, whether that be as part of the formal criminal justice system or wider civil issues, it seems to me that that position is already created for the effective delivery. The other aspect is the effect on the actual local economy, and the SCS have been at pains to say that they're not necessarily having a direct impact on that, or the impact might be only for the short term. Again, I feel that that's not looking at it in the broadest sense. To remove a significant public sector body, organisation or function from a local area would have a significant impact in my thought process to the local area. That brings a footfall, whether the people that work there or the people that are making use of the facility, in whichever way that might be, that they will be going out into the local community and contributing to the economy in some way. So to me, they most certainly would have a direct effect.
Thank you. Jenny, followed by Lewis.
Thanks, Convener. Mr Carroll, presumably some of your members might be transferred to another location as a result of these closures, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And will there be any redundancy implications for your members?
Scottish Court Service have given a commitment that there would be no compulsory redundancies as a result of these closures taking place. They have also given an assurance that certainly on the basis of the current budgetary climate, that there will be no further voluntary redundancy scheme either to be run within Scottish Court Service. However, that doesn't mean to say that there might be one or two people affected by the court closures who might not choose to move to another court and make a decision which might actually free them from the employ of Scottish Court Service.
So you're saying that there might be members of your union, you know, have to travel a lot further to their work, but might not be willing to do that, so might take a voluntary redundancy package?
Possibly.
Do you have any concerns about changes in contracts for your members as a result of this restructuring?
No, there's been no proposals for changes of contract whatsoever.
Okay. Do you have any members who are involved in security services around the prisons?
No.
Sorry, around the courts?
No.
Okay.
They're all the security services are all contracted out.
Mm-hmm. And do you? I know you can only speak for your own members, but do you have concerns as a trade unionist for any change in contracts for any of these other services that are private?
I think in most of the courts, if not all the courts that are proposed for closure, there is no permanent security team, for example. There would be possibly an effect on the transportation of prisoners, for example, or custody cases. But we haven't heard that any of these services are actually going to be affected in the ways that you have mentioned. And as far as I'm aware, we don't have any members within those sectors in any event.
And do you feel there's been sufficient liaison between your union and the Scottish Court Service on the impact for your staff, for your members?
In terms of the discussions that we have had, we have felt that they have been done in the spirit of partnership, and Scottish Court Service have certainly kept us informed right from the very start about how the proposals were going to proceed and how that would possibly affect our members, and we've had detailed discussions all the way through on that. That's not to say, though, that we're certainly not concerned about the impact that this is going to have on members. For example, as we've heard from other panellists, and the impact it might have on court users, for examples in terms of caring for children or caring for relatives who might be mentally or physically impaired, then people are going to have very significant changes to their lifestyle to manage. And that is something which we have tried to put over to Scottish Court Service as well. Not only that, the travel disruption that is going to be caused to our members in moving to another court is also, those travel disruptions and difficulties and experiences are going to fall onto all court users as well. And some of the stories that we've heard about people who live in, for example, rural communities who are having to, possibly if they were to move to a court, for example, they're not on a public transport route, a bus does pass and they have to phone for the bus to stop at a particular point, or they have to go to the rail station and flag down the train, which sometimes doesn't see them flagging them down until it's past the rail station, and the rail train has to then reverse back to pick them up. These are difficulties that are going to happen to the people of Scotland as these proposals come into effect.
Thank you, Mr. Kyle.
Can I just have a clarification about the contracts? Is there a term within, a standard term within the contracts which would require your members to work at different courts, for instance, and not just in one specific court?
There's nothing in terms of working in specific courts for a lengthy period of time. Our members can be asked to work in different locations from time to time. There are specific bits of contracts which apply to different grades. But for example, administrative grades and support grades can only be asked to do that if the court is within reasonable travelling distance. Now, that then translates into an hour and a quarter's travel time each way. So that is our policy in terms of that. But those who are on lower management grades, EO and above, can be asked to work in any court at any time.
I just wanted clarification that in terms of the contract, there might have been required in any event without any restructuring to move around, as many contracts do with people in any event in employment. You wanted to ask, Nigel?
I did want to come in on a specific point. We're trying to keep it general, as Mr. Carroll will appreciate. Where in any of these courts that we're talking about, a member of staff lives, as it were, the wrong side in the context of transfer, and we can quite see they may have personal circumstances where they look after an elderly relative or whatever. You know, life is sometimes difficult. In the circumstance where it really isn't sensible for that person to transfer, and you know, at a human level we would understand that. Are you comfortable that what's been negotiated will give a sensible package to the person who really cannot actually be asked to transfer?
Yes, we are still hopeful that that will be the case. There are obviously places where, for example, I know Stonehaven, Aberdeen has been mentioned quite a lot this morning, where members of staff who work in Stonehaven actually live south of Stonehaven. So they would actually have particular difficulty in getting into Aberdeen. So they have expressed a wish to work at another court, not Aberdeen. And that's not the only area where that has happened. Having said that, there are areas where, for example, people, instead of moving to the court where the business was going to be transferred to, have actually asked for a relocation or even a move to another court of a greater distance, which suits their circumstances. And we are hopeful that Scottish Court Service will give those members the wishes that they have expressed.
So you're getting the right kind of vibes, if I may put it that way.
In terms of the membership, yes. One thing I would add, though, is that where we represented members in their one-to-ones with HR, all members expressed as their first option was to stay where they currently work.
Yes, thank you.
Lewis, followed by Alison.
Thank you very much. I'd be interested in the perspective of all the witnesses from either the point of view of social work services, of sheriff clerks, or of those providing advice to the public. We've heard this morning from the first panel of witnesses that Edinburgh could accommodate extra court cases at no cost. We heard that Aberdeen was vastly out of line with the target set for the speed in which trials were called. What is your view for the receiving courts, be it in Fife, be it Aberdeen, Edinburgh or Inverness? What is your view of the capacity of receiving courts to take on expanded business as a consequence of closures of courts nearby?
Who wants to take that one? Mr. McCloskey.
We would have concerns that in real terms, a lot of these court buildings that are designated as receiving courts, they're old buildings. There isn't the capacity. They're already full of people, particularly in the mornings where there's criminal and civil business going ahead. They are cram-packed with people. They're cram-packed full of agencies and organisations that need to work in the court setting. And to actually just say, to do what we would regard as a small feasibility study into the capacity required, I think is, again, a very narrow view. And again, we would have concerns that there is sufficient capacity in a number of the courts.
Which ones?
If you're looking at Forfar is an older court. Arbroath is 15 miles down the road. There is insufficient capacity. They're talking about Tain as being one of the options. Tain's not a court that's suitable for people with disabilities, or physical disabilities, and yet they're potentially closing Dornoch. That, it just seems a very narrow view in terms of where the court business and where the decisions have been made. Yes, we acknowledge there are some court buildings that need renovation, they need some investment, but just to say, well, we'll close them because they happen to be in a rural setting, just seems a very narrow and short-sighted view.
Councillor Kennedy.
Yeah, no, whilst I can't respond in terms of the actual operational side of it in terms of capacity, I have, in relation to the Cooper proposed move to Dundee, have spoken with local legal representatives, and they already are very conscious of huge challenges within Dundee Sheriff Court. Just in simply having a conversation with a client, perhaps, that there are not the rooms for people to go and have more appropriate private conversations. I think looking at it slightly more broadly and thinking about the effect on other agencies, because you did mention social work and things, that for me it's there has to be an effect in the future in terms of how we get through business, and therefore ultimately an effect on some of the expectations that are already placed on the justice system through our government's expectations in relation to CPOs, for example, the speed and immediacy. There's going to have to be some sort of effect on the operational focus going forward.
Ms. Wood.
I think, again, with civil business, it's my concern that in general, civil business tends to be squeezed when there's a bulk of criminal business, and I think that's a pattern that would happen in any court. And I suppose, you know, in a way, quite rightly, if somebody's been stabbed, then it's probably better that the person who stabbed them is brought to justice. But I think the approach to this so far has been very much in terms of the status quo. So how will the business be condensed? And how will we do that based on how we do things just now? And I think what's really being missed is an opportunity to look at how civil business could be done differently. So how civil business could be split from criminal business, not necessarily in terms of court building, because that presents difficulties, but the potential for evening courts and weekend courts. And then the design of summary sheriffs, something I would be very keen to see is a different take on how they should hear cases. So to hear cases in locations that aren't court buildings, to be specialists in peripatetic. I think it's one thing to think of how condensed business will work the way that we see things are just now, but I do think there's huge opportunity to look at business being moved and to look at the ways that business can be improved, and I think that opportunity is being slightly missed in the proposal.
Advised that this is coming, and you'll be delighted to know this. I mean, you'll be experts in court processes by the end of this session, that the business of whether there's evening courts or weekend courts, I'm just taking a minute, will come before this committee next year under court reform. We're all looking forward to it. I feel I'm in a perpetual university tutorial in this committee. Mr. Carroll.
I was going to touch on the court reform, because there is no doubt that will bring more complex cases to the sheriff courts, whether they're the specialist courts and the jury centres, or whether they are going to be the summary sheriff courts, because business is going to be devolved. One thing that we're concerned about, though, is that there was no figures given in the consultation regarding the anticipated devolving of business from the High Court, and I know that Alison McInnes mentioned that this morning. That's likely to be significant, and it's likely to be very complex cases that will come down both from the High Court and from the Court of Session. Complex cases take time to administer and adjudicate on, and this could have a severe impact on a reduced estate's capacity to cope. If Aberdeen, for example, is running at 97% capacity with just the Stonehaven business transferred in, without the devolving of business as stated, will it be able to cope when Stonehaven isn't there and there is no resilience for any backup? Now, there was mention this morning as well, I think by Alison McInnes, of the 60 cases that were moved from Aberdeen to Stonehaven. That was sheriff and jury cases. For the whole of 2013, a week-long sitting has been fixed in Stonehaven every month for that year to take those 60 cases, because they couldn't be taken in Aberdeen. So I think there is a capacity issue there. I would just also like to say, in terms of the overall strategy of SCS, closing courts is an easy option, but I think from PCS...
Apparently not.
Well, I think you've heard from the panellists here that it certainly appears to be. But there were alternatives suggested within the responses, and there's been alternatives suggested in past Justice Committees and in Justice Committee here this morning about ways of making efficiencies. Video conferencing is one, but that's not the be-all and end-all. There are difficulties with video conferencing, and we've heard people mention those difficulties earlier. Improved court programming, well, as we've heard again, that's not the be-all and end-all because not everything fits into slots. And we have within the justice system the human element, which actually brings a lot of issues and problems to deal with. Better utilisation of available courts and court time, etc., all appear to have been ignored. But we just wonder if the strategy is the right one. For example, you're looking at Haddington, it's been mentioned about Peebles this morning. You've practically got justice centres sitting there already. Stonehaven, Aberdeen, the strategy from the consultation was that they were going to merge Justice of the Peace courts in towns and cities where separate buildings were in existence. In Aberdeen, anecdotally, I have heard that they're now looking to keep the Justice of the Peace Court, to buy accommodation from the police above the courtroom that exists at the moment, to make capacity to take the business from Stonehaven, because I have heard anecdotally that the local council is not going to...
Who from, Mr Carroll, this anecdote?
Shall we say members of Scottish Court Service.
Oh.
And we have heard, and I've heard from the leader of the Labour Council in the Labour group in Aberdeen. Now, I don't know whether he has had communication from the council officials or not, but in Aberdeen, I have heard that the council are no longer giving the option to Scottish Court Service to buy up the vacant property that is directly next door to Aberdeen Sheriff Court. So they're now having to look at buying alternative accommodation, probably from the police. Now that goes against the overall strategy of merging the courts within the same location. We've also got our Arbroath-Forfar situation. We've heard a lot about the Arbroath-Forfar situation this morning. A number of years ago, we had the Justice Centre made in Livingston. That was the right move at that particular time. That court was built within that particular jurisdiction. Linlithgow was closed. Livingston moved to where the population is. What's being suggested for Arbroath? Arbroath has a near 60,000 population. Forfar has 25,000 of a population. That goes against the overall strategy in my view. So I'm just wondering where the strategy is and what the priorities are.
No doubt we'll ask the Cabinet Secretary and others. Ms Wood.
Just to add to a point Brian made about capacity as well, there's been a lot of talk about reduced business over the last few years, and reduced criminal business, I think, is a good thing. But reduced civil business, I've not heard many people question why civil business has reduced. Why are less people bringing small claims actions? I think that's quite an important point to be addressed. We've certainly not seen the people who come through the bureau doors having any less problems and having any more straightforward problems. In fact, they have more problems and more complex problems than they've ever had before.
The problems small claims court.
I mean, you know, problems with kind of housing or debt or that potentially could have a resolution in the civil courts. And in terms of housing, one big change that's happened recently that I'm sure everybody's aware of is the under-occupancy charges. Across Scotland, there are around 150,000 people affected by under-occupancy, 80,000 of those who are disabled. If even a quarter of those cases came before the civil courts and in eviction cases, that would hugely increase the numbers of civil cases brought before the courts across Scotland. I know there is discussion just now about a housing panel, but the point that I would make in relation to that is discussion. And so it's very difficult to make an informed and thoughtful decision about whether court closures and condensed business are a good or bad idea based on past court business and with the kind of the discussions that are happening around housing, but with no promises of what's actually going to go forward in that arena.
Alison, followed by Roddy.
Thank you. A couple of lines to explore. I wonder if I could ask Councillor Kennedy to tell me if she has any concerns about the proposal to move some of the Fife business into Dundee, which then takes it into a different criminal justice authority, whether you think there will be any knock-on effects from that. And secondly, you touched on child protection orders. It would be useful for me, certainly, and maybe for other members, to understand how frequently we might need swift access to a sheriff to be able to get a child protection order, what kind of impact that will have on your criminal justice social workers.
Thank you. In terms of the move of business, Cooper is placed in a unique position by the proposals because it's taking the relevant business out with both a council area, out with the Community Justice Authority area, as Alison mentions. It also takes us out of the NHS and also the police division. So we're immediately creating, I'm not suggesting by any manner means that professionals can't function in a different way, can't find a different way of addressing it. But I think when you're dealing with people's complex problems with speed and immediacy around, or seen to be dealing with things under those terms, then to move wholesale from all of those supportive functions into another jurisdiction in the sense of just adding in as opposed to using all those services in a different place. It's not that you're still needing to bring the support services that you already have at the present time with you. So for me, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of logic with that, whilst I do, in a professional sense, respect that professionals will have to address that. But obviously our CGIE has an area plan which all the partners sign up to, they contribute to. It's not just us writing it, they contribute to the writing of it. So, so therefore there will be, in my opinion, a significant impact. In terms of the child protection order, I don't feel that I could perhaps give you a great deal of the response you might be seeking, but I would certainly sort of link it to some of the other things that I've said in relation to speed and immediacy. That's huge. With child protection, you're needing to, my colleagues maybe answer it better, but you need to be addressing things very quickly to help hopefully prevent any further harm. So getting them into the system and being appropriately looked after would seem to be critical, which could be challenged by coming out with your own jurisdiction and then back into those issues that other panels have discussed, this business about what the capacity is and being able to be flexible about responding to an urgent need.
If it was possible, Convener, perhaps your authority could send a written submission on that particular issue. If I can move on to my final question, the panel will have heard me raising the equality impact assessment earlier, which we've not had an ability to look at, although the court service assure us that they carried one out. It seems from the evidence we've heard this morning and much of the written evidence that there will be an imbalanced impact on children and vulnerable witnesses in particular. Does the panel have a view on whether or not there's been enough in-depth analysis of that?
If I could maybe answer that one. I think that Scottish Courts Service did carry out a series of roadshows last summer, just in general terms about what the implications might be. And we attended each of those, I think it was either 6 or 8 events. I know they, in relation to the Victims and Witnesses Bill, also did an assessment of the additional number of special measures that may be required through the increase of 16, 17-year-olds, the addition of victims of sexual abuse. So there's about 18,000 additional special measures may be required moving forward, which is an awful lot of people that will require the different types of special measure, whether it be remote, TV links, or a supporter. So that puts a burden on Scottish Court Service as well as the Crown, as well as Victim Support Scotland, and we want to help people, absolutely, but there's an extra potentially 18,000 people that we would require to help on the day. And also one aspect of work that we do, which is really important for people, is a pre-court familiarisation visit. And we would offer that, and we do offer that to everybody. And our concern would be, again, if courts are not there, the additional travel and expense and inconvenience that it places on victims and witnesses, as well as our resources as well. So again, that needs to be considered, I think, in the wider impact assessment.
Body.
I'd just like to address this to Councillor Kennedy, if I can. A wee bit parochial. We heard earlier on evidence from Eric McQueen that he hadn't had any recent engagement with the Criminal Social Work Department in relation to proposals. Have you had any recent interaction with the Scottish Court Service about these matters?
The only interaction I've had was when I secured a public meeting in Cooper, which Eric McQueen and his colleague attended, and that was done jointly with our Criminal Justice Social Work and Fife Council. And that's the only contact that I've had, and certainly the only contact I'm aware, direct contact, that Criminal Justice Social Work and Fife has had with them.
I understand rather late in the day, Fife Council commissioned an economic assessment of the impact in Cooper. Can you advise what the current position is with that?
It really a reinforcement of what they've previously submitted. That I haven't got any other. No.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm going to conclude. I'm not going to say I have no other questions, because if I say that, somebody put their hand up. Can I thank you very much for your evidence, and thank you most of all for your patience and endurance in waiting for all this time, and thank you for your evidence. Before I go close the meeting, I want to tell you that I think you've got your draft, this is the committee, you've got a draft work programme, but for the benefit of the two members who are not in the committee, I intend to swap so that the 11th of June we can consider the SSI shaping Scotland's court services, and the business we'd set down for the 18th of June provisionally, police and fire reform, information of provisions, offensive behaviour correspondence, criminal justice bill and appointment of budget advisor, we'll swap that to the following week, if that's okay with you. It's to allow you to consider the SSIs earlier. And also, I think that's all I want to say in public. So we're now going to private session. We conclude the meeting.